8 years. Vivian Ashford had spent 8 years learning how to breathe without him, without the weight of his arms around her shoulders, without the sound of his laugh filling up a room, without that small silver compass that never left his neck. Not once, not ever. And then, on a Tuesday night in October, surrounded by 500 of the wealthiest people in the city, she saw it, hanging around the neck of a complete stranger, gleaming under the chandelier light like it had been waiting for her all along. If you've ever lost someone and thought the story was over, stay with me, because this one is just beginning. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's go. The Hargrove Grand Hotel had been built in 1923, and whoever designed it had clearly believed that wealth was best expressed through excess. The ceiling stretched 40 feet overhead, painted with scenes of mythological figures that nobody ever looked at anymore. 12 chandeliers. Imported marble floors the color of cream. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned that the rich preferred to pretend the help was invisible. It was the kind of place that made Vivian Ashford's jaw tighten the moment she walked through the door. She'd grown up poor enough to know exactly what this room was performing, and wealthy enough now to be expected to perform it alongside everyone else. That particular tension, the one between who she'd been and who she'd become, had lived in her chest for so long that she'd mostly stopped noticing it. Mostly. "You're doing the face," said a voice at her elbow. Vivian turned. Her assistant, Dana, a 26-year-old woman with an extraordinary talent for reading the room and an equally extraordinary talent for saying things nobody else dared say, was watching her with careful eyes. "What face?" "The one where you're deciding whether the marble floor is worth what they paid for it." "It's not," Vivian said. "Probably not," Dana agreed. She handed Vivian a glass of sparkling water. "The Kellerman Foundation people are near the east wall. They're going to want 15 minutes. Give me 20 before you steer them over." "Done." Dana slipped back into the crowd and Vivian turned to face the room properly. The Hargrove Charity Gala happened every October, raising money for pediatric hospital programs across the state. It was one of the 3 events per year Vivian attended without argument, because the cause was real and the need was genuine, and she'd sat beside enough sick children in enough hospital corridors to know that the money actually went somewhere. She moved through the crowd the way she'd learned to, with purpose, not urgency. Pausing for conversations that mattered, gracefully deflecting the ones that didn't. She shook hands with a state senator whose name she remembered and a tech CEO whose name she'd already forgotten. She smiled at the right moments. She laughed when it was called for. She was good at this. She hated that she was good at this. Nathaniel had been better. Nathaniel had been genuinely good at it, which was different. He hadn't learned how to make people feel seen. He'd actually seen them. There was a gap between those two things that Vivian had never quite managed to close, no matter how many years passed or how many rooms like this one she walked through. She was thinking about him. She was almost always thinking about him in rooms like this. She'd learned not to be surprised by it. When she saw the necklace, it happened the way these things always happen in the movies, which is to say it didn't happen that way at all. There was no slow motion, no dramatic music. A man across the room shifted his weight and laughed at something someone said, and the movement caused the front of his jacket to open slightly, and the silver pendant caught the light from one of the 12 chandeliers overhead, and Vivian's brain registered it before her eyes had fully focused. Her hand went cold around the glass. She told herself she was wrong. She was seeing things. It had been a long evening, and the lighting was theatrical, and her mind played tricks sometimes. Had played tricks since Nathaniel died, would probably play tricks until she did. She took a breath. She looked again. The man was standing maybe 30 feet away, near one of the tall windows that overlooked the city. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, dark hair that needed a cut, broad shoulders filling out a navy blazer that was good quality but not new, the kind of jacket a man bought for occasions he didn't attend very often. He was listening to someone talk, nodding with the careful attention of a person who is genuinely interested rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Perched on his left hip, half asleep against his shoulder with the complete physical confidence of a small child who trusted the person holding her completely, was a little girl in a yellow dress. 4 years old, maybe 5. She had a ribbon in her hair that was coming undone. And around the man's neck on a thin silver chain that Vivian recognized because she had helped clasp it herself on their wedding morning was Nathaniel's compass. She stood very still. The compass was small, about the size of a silver dollar, octagonal, with a rose detail engraved on the back that you could only see if you turned it over. Vivian knew because she'd turned it over 1,000 times. Nathaniel had bought it at an antique shop in Vermont during the first year they were married, paying $40 for something the shop owner said was probably worth $12, because he'd liked the way it felt in his hand. "I always want to know which way I'm pointed," he'd told her. "Not because I'm lost, just because I like knowing." He'd worn it every day for 15 years. He was wearing it the morning he drove north for what was supposed to be a routine volunteer shift with the mountain rescue team. He was wearing it when he called her from the road to say he'd be home by Sunday. He didn't come home by Sunday. He didn't come home at all. The search and recovery team found him 2 days later at the base of a ravine, not far from a stretch of mountain road where a landslide had partially collapsed. The official account said he'd been involved in some kind of rescue effort during the storm. There were signs of it, evidence that someone had worked to extract a vehicle from beneath debris. But the details were fragmented and incomplete, and the storm had destroyed much of what might have explained how it happened, or why he was there in the first place. The necklace was never recovered. They told her it could have gone anywhere, washed away in the runoff, buried under debris, lost in the chaos of the scene. She'd accepted that. She'd had no choice but to accept it. She was looking at it right now, hanging around the neck of a man she'd never seen before in her life. Vivian set her glass down on a passing tray without looking. She was moving before she'd made the conscious decision to move, cutting through the crowd with the kind of focus that made people step aside without quite knowing why. She got close enough to be certain, close enough to see the octagonal shape of the pendant, the worn silver edge that came from 15 years of being handled. Close enough to notice that the chain was different. The original chain had broken at some point, clearly, and been replaced with something slightly thicker. But the pendant was the same. "Excuse me," her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man turned and she saw his face properly for the first time. He had the kind of features that were easy to overlook individually, ordinary enough, but something in the arrangement of them, the combination, gave him a quality that was harder to dismiss, like a house that wasn't architecturally notable but that you kept driving past anyway. He looked at her with mild curiosity, no recognition. The little girl on his hip stirred slightly and blinked, then decided whatever was happening wasn't worth waking up for and pressed her face back into his shoulder. "Hi," he said. "I'm sorry to interrupt." She wasn't, quite, but the social machinery still operated. "I noticed your necklace." Something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness exactly, more like the careful attention of someone who'd had this conversation before and wasn't sure what version it was about to be. "Yeah?" he said. "The pendant." She kept her voice neutral with effort that probably didn't show. "May I ask where you got it?" He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he'd been looking at the person he was talking to before, with that quality of actual seeing rather than surface reading, and then something in his expression went quieter. "It's a long story," he said. "I have time." A pause. The little girl made a small sound in her sleep, and he shifted her weight automatically, the practiced adjustment of a parent who'd done it 10,000 times. "Okay," he said. And then, because apparently he was a man who meant what he said, "My name's Elliot. Elliot Mercer." Vivian Ashford. She watched his eyes, looking for recognition of her name, the small recalibration that happened when people realized who she was, the slight change in posture or tone. It happened with almost everyone. It didn't happen with him. "Nice to meet you," he said, like he meant that too, and then he glanced around at the noise and the crowd. "Is there somewhere quieter?" There was a small terrace off the east corridor, mostly empty, the city spread out below them in the October dark. They stood at the railing with a foot of space between them and the little girl still half asleep against Elliot's shoulder, her ribbon now fully undone and dangling. "Her name's Lily," Elliot said when he noticed Vivian looking. "She's usually better at staying awake at events, but it's past 9. She's beautiful." "She's trouble," he said, but the way he said it made the word mean something else entirely. Vivian looked at the pendant again. Up close, in the cleaner light from the terrace sconces, there was no doubt left in her. She'd been hoping, somewhere in the back of her mind, that proximity would reveal some difference, a wrong detail, a different weight, something that would let her tell herself she'd been mistaken. There was nothing like that. It was the compass. It was Nathaniel's compass. "Will you tell me where it came from?" she asked. Elliot was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. Lily stirred, shifted, went still again. "My daughter knows the short version," he said. "I tell her a man gave it to me, a stranger who helped me and who I never got to thank." He paused. "The longer version is a little harder to explain." "Try," Vivian said. He looked at her sideways. "You're going to think I'm sentimental. I've thought worse things about people for better reasons." That got a small sound from him. Not quite a laugh, almost. He looked back at the city. "About 7 years ago," he said, "I was driving back from a job upstate. October, like now. Late, and the weather was bad, worse than I'd known when I left, the kind of storm that comes in fast and just turns everything sideways. I was on 94, the mountain stretch, the part that goes through the Carver Pass." Vivian went very still. There'd been a landslide. Part of the road had come down. Rocks, mud, a section of the embankment. There was a car caught in it, partially buried. A station wagon. He paused. "I could see someone moving inside." "What did you do?" "I stopped." He said it like it wasn't a decision. "I don't know. I didn't really think about it. You see something like that and your body just goes before your brain has a chance to weigh in. I got out and I started trying to clear enough debris to get the door open." He shifted Lily's weight again. She made a small protesting sound, and he murmured something to her, and she subsided. "There was another man there," Elliot continued. "I don't know where he came from. I didn't see another car, but visibility was maybe 20 feet in that rain. He just appeared beside me and started helping. Didn't say much, just worked." Vivian's throat felt tight. "We got the door open," Elliot said. "There was a woman inside, late 40s, unconscious but breathing, and a teenage boy in the back seat who was okay, mostly, just scared. We got them out and moved them back from the road. Called for help on my phone, and then a second piece of the embankment came loose and I didn't see it in time." He stopped. "The other man saw it," he said. "He pulled me sideways, hard enough that I hit the ground and scraped up half my arm." He said it without drama, just reporting the fact. "The debris hit where I'd been standing. If he hadn't—" A small pause. "He was bigger than me, faster than I expected." Vivian pressed her hand flat against the railing. "After," Elliot said, "when things had calmed down and the ambulance came and everything was being dealt with, I realized he was gone, just gone. Didn't say goodbye, didn't wait for any of it. I didn't even get his name." He looked at the pendant. "A few days later, I went back to help with the road clearing. They had a volunteer crew going, and I found the necklace in the mud, about 20 feet from where we'd been working. The chain was broken. I put it in my pocket, and I kept looking for who it belonged to, but I never—" He stopped again, shorter this time. "I never found out." He turned and looked at her properly, and she could tell from his face, from the way his expression had changed while he was talking, that he'd figured out something he hadn't known when he started. "You knew him," Elliot said. It wasn't a question. Vivian didn't answer right away. She was looking at the pendant, and she was thinking about Nathaniel calling her from the road that Sunday morning, his voice easy and unhurried, saying, "I'll be home by Sunday, Viv. Stop worrying." She was thinking about the way he always drove the mountain roads too fast and argued that he didn't. She was thinking about how he'd been a volunteer with the rescue team for 11 years and had never once let himself be the person who stood back and watched. "He was my husband," she said. The terrace was quiet for a moment. Down below, the city moved and breathed the way cities do, indifferent to the particular weight of the moment happening 30 stories above it. "His name was Nathaniel," Vivian said. "Nathaniel Ashford. He died that weekend. They found him. They found him not far from where you're describing 2 days after the storm." Elliot said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something complicated. Something that sat between grief and something else she didn't have a word for yet. "He saved your life," she said. "Yeah," Elliot said quietly. He did. She held out her hand and he understood. He unclasped the chain and laid the compass in her palm. It was lighter than she remembered, or maybe she'd forgotten how light it was, or maybe grief had made it heavier in her memory than it ever was in life. She turned it over. The rose detail on the back was still there, worn smoother than she remembered, but there. She closed her fingers around it. She stood there with her eyes down for a moment, not crying. She was past the age and the rawness of tears for Nathaniel, mostly, though the feeling that lived in the same place wasn't gone, just quieter. And she breathed. 8 years, she said. I didn't know what his last hours looked like. I knew he died. I knew generally where. I knew he was probably doing something brave because that was the only version of Nathaniel that existed. Her voice was even. She'd worked hard to make it even. But I didn't know. There's a difference between knowing and knowing. Yeah, Elliot said again, differently. Lily chose that moment to wake up. She lifted her head from her father's shoulder with the abrupt, total alertness that small children sometimes switch into, looked around, assessed the situation. Dark city, 2 adults at a railing, one of them holding something small, and then looked at Vivian with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a 5-year-old. What's that? She asked. A compass, Vivian said. Lily considered this. Does it show you where to go? Vivian looked down at the small silver octagon in her palm. She thought about Nathaniel buying it in Vermont. She thought about him wearing it every day for 15 years. She thought about it lying in the mud on a mountain road while this man and his daughter went on living partly because of what Nathaniel had done in his last hours on Earth. I think, she said slowly, that it might. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer and rested her head back on her father's shoulder, though her eyes stayed open now, watching Vivian with the patient, serious attention of a child who had decided an adult was worth watching. Elliot was looking at the compass too. You should keep it, he said. Vivian shook her head. I want to hear the rest of the story first. She offered it back to him. Put it on. He hesitated, then took it and clasped it back around his neck. It settled against his chest the way it had for years, the way it had against Nathaniel's chest for 15 years before that, and something about seeing it there, settled, worn, belonging, was not as painful as Vivian would have expected. It was something closer to right. She leaned against the railing. Tell me everything, she said, from the beginning. And Elliot Mercer, who had spent 7 years carrying a stranger's compass and a debt he couldn't repay, began to talk. The storm had started building around 4 in the afternoon, though Elliot hadn't paid much attention to it. He'd been doing a restoration job for a client 3 hours north, a Victorian roll-top desk that had been in a barn for 40 years and needed more patience than skill, though it required a fair amount of both. And he'd been focused on finishing so he could be home before Lily's bedtime. She'd been 2 years old that October, old enough to know when her father wasn't there, old enough to stand at the window and watch for the truck. His mother-in-law had been staying with them since Sarah died, since the car accident 14 months earlier that had rearranged every fact of Elliot's life. And she was capable and kind and completely steady, but she wasn't him, and Lily knew the difference, and some nights that knowledge lived in her crying, and those nights were hard on everyone. So he'd rushed. He'd finished faster than he should have, cleaned up faster than he should have, and he'd been on the road by 3:30 with the storm coming in from the northwest, and his truck's windshield wipers struggling by the time he hit the mountain stretch. The Carver Pass was a 23-mile section of Route 94 that the locals called the back road, and that anyone with sense called something worse. It saved 40 minutes compared to the interstate, and Elliot had driven it dozens of times, and he knew that the calculus on it changed dramatically in bad weather, and he'd made the decision anyway because Lily was waiting, and because he was 25 and still capable of the particular kind of confidence that later in life becomes recognizable as stupidity. He'd been doing about 30, slow for the road, not slow enough for the conditions, when he came around the curve at mile 16 and the headlights swept across the scene. The station wagon was on its side, partially collapsed under a section of the embankment that had come down across the road. It was a messy, violent kind of scene. Rocks and mud and tree debris thrown everywhere, one of the car's rear wheels still spinning slowly in the rain. The headlights of the car were still on. They pointed sideways into the dark. Elliot stopped the truck. He remembered the particular quality of silence in those first seconds after he cut his engine. The rain on the roof, the wind, and underneath it, coming from the car, something that took him a moment to identify. A human voice. High-pitched. A kid. He got out. The rain hit him like a wall. Within 30 seconds, he was soaked through and the footing on the road was treacherous, the mud and loose rock shifting under his boots. He picked his way toward the car, using his phone's flashlight because the truck's headlights didn't quite reach. "Hey!" he shouted. "Is someone in there?" "My mom!" The voice was coming from the back window, which was cracked open. "She's not waking up. My mom won't wake up." Elliot got to the car. The station wagon had come to rest on the driver's side, which meant the passenger side was angled upward. He could see through the cracked rear window. A teenage boy, 15 or 16, pressed against the side of the car with his seatbelt still on, twisted awkwardly. In the front, through the gap between the seats, he could see a woman slumped over the steering wheel, not moving. "Listen to me," Elliot said through the window, keeping his voice steady because the kid needed steady. "What's your name?" "Cody." A pause. "Is my mom okay?" "I'm going to get you both out. Is anything hurting you? Your neck? Your back?" "My arm, maybe. I don't know." "Okay. I'm going to try to get this door open. Don't panic if it takes a minute." He went to work. The rear door on the passenger side, the one facing up, was buckled slightly, but not crushed. He got his fingers under the handle, braced his feet, and pulled. It moved an inch, then stuck. He repositioned, pulled again. 2 inches. 3. "Can I help?" The voice came from behind him, and Elliot's heart nearly stopped before his brain caught up. He spun around. A man was standing in the rain. Big. 6'2", maybe. Broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that comes from a life of actual use rather than deliberate maintenance. He was probably 40, give or take, wearing a flannel jacket that was already soaked through, and he was looking at the situation with calm, assessing eyes. "Who are you?" Elliot said, which was not especially useful but was the thing that came out. "Just someone who stopped," the man said. He was already moving toward the car. "How many inside?" "A woman, unconscious. A kid, maybe 15, says his arm hurts." "Driver's side is pinned." The man crouched down, checked the underside of the car, stood back up. "Rear door's the move." "Yeah, that's what I was—" "You pull. I'll brace the chassis." It was not a question or a request exactly. The man put his shoulder against the car's underside, finding purchase against one of the frame members, and braced himself in a way that clearly drew on some understanding of where the structural weight was. Then he nodded. Elliot pulled. With the car's weight properly counterbalanced, the door came free on the second attempt, swinging upward and back. Elliot got Cody out first, hoisted him up through the opening, got him clear of the car, moved him back to the road's edge where the footing was better. The boy was shaking badly, and his left arm was held against his body in the careful way of someone managing real pain, but he was conscious and coherent. "Stay right here," Elliot told him. "Don't move." "My mom, we're getting her." Getting the woman out was harder. She was unconscious, dead weight, and the angle of the car made it awkward. The other man climbed partially into the interior, working from above, while Elliot guided from below, and they managed it in stages, a process that was messy and slow and that involved at least one moment where Elliot was genuinely uncertain they were going to be able to do it. They did it. They laid her on the road surface, away from the car. She was breathing. Elliot could see the rise and fall of her chest, uneven but present. He called 911, gave them the mile marker, and was in the middle of describing the scene when the sound came. A deep, low groan from above, the kind of sound that Earth makes when something heavy in it shifts. He looked up. The section of embankment above the first debris field was moving. He could see it in the beam of his flashlight, a slow, inevitable slide beginning about 30 feet up, a mass of mud and rock and uprooted scrub that was maybe the size of a car. He had about 2 seconds before it arrived. He didn't have time to move. The math didn't work, the distance was wrong, His feet were in mud and his brain was still processing. And then something hit him from the side, hard and fast, and the ground came up and he was sliding, and a sound like a truck hitting a wall came from where he'd been standing. And then everything was just rain and his own breathing and gravel in his palms. He lay still for a moment, alive. His arm was bleeding where he'd hit the road surface, and his shoulder ached, and his phone was somewhere in the dark. But he was alive. He turned over. The other man was on one knee nearby, breathing hard, one hand braced on the ground. The second debris field had hit the car again, burying the front half of it further, and it had taken a chunk of road with it. If Elliot had still been standing there, "You okay?" the man said. "Yeah." Elliot sat up, "But you..." "Yeah. Thank you." The man just nodded, stood up, brushed mud off his knees. Like it was nothing. Like he hadn't just tackled a stranger out of the way of a landslide. "Ambulance is coming," Elliot said. He realized his hand was still on his phone, which had somehow survived the fall. "I told them." "Good." They got the woman into the recovery position, kept the boy calm, cleared some of the debris from around the road edge to make it safer when the emergency vehicles arrived. They worked without much talking because there wasn't much that needed saying. The situation was clear and the tasks were clear, and the man beside Elliot seemed to understand both without needing them spelled out. The ambulance came 22 minutes later. The state police came 7 minutes after that. By the time Elliot had finished giving his account to the officer and turned around to look for the man who'd worked beside him, he was gone. No car that Elliot could see. No footprints in the churned-up mud that he could definitely attribute to him. Just gone, the way he'd appeared. Like someone the storm had briefly produced and then taken back. Elliot asked the officer if he'd spoken to another man at the scene. The officer said he hadn't. Said he'd only found Elliot and the two civilians. He drove home in wet clothes with mud in his boots and his arm bandaged with a strip of his own flannel shirt, and Lily asleep when he got there, her fist curled around the ear of a stuffed rabbit. His mother-in-law had left the kitchen light on. He stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a long time and watched her breathe. He went back 4 days later with a work crew that was helping clear the road. He told himself he went because it was the right thing, which was true. He also went because something about leaving that place without understanding it entirely felt wrong, and he was the kind of person who didn't do well with unfinished things. He found the necklace near the end of the second day, half buried in the mud about 20 feet from where the second debris field had hit. The chain was broken, snapped clean, probably during the impact, but the pendant was undamaged. He cleaned it off, turned it over in his palm, and looked at the small octagonal silver compass and the rose detail on the back. He asked around the crew. Nobody recognized it. Nobody had heard of another person being at the scene the night of the storm. He filed a report with the local sheriff's office, found property, description, location, and gave them his number. Nobody called. He tried for 2 months, put up a notice in the general store near the pass, left a description with the ranger station. The silence was complete. Eventually, he stopped actively searching and started simply keeping it. He didn't wear it right away. It sat on his workbench for almost a year, next to the tools and the half-finished projects, the object of occasional consideration. It didn't feel like his. It also didn't feel like something he should abandon. One morning he put it on, not sure why, and he'd kept it on since. 7 years. On the terrace, with October settling cold around them and the city below humming at its own separate frequency, Elliot finished talking and went quiet. Vivian was looking out at the dark. She'd listened without interrupting, really listened, the way you have to when someone is handing you something irreplaceable and fragile, and the only way to receive it properly is to hold very still. She'd tracked every detail. The mile marker, the station wagon, the rain, the second slide, the way Nathaniel had appeared and disappeared, like he'd been passing through rather than stopping, like he'd never intended anyone to know he'd been there. That was so entirely Nathaniel that it nearly broke her open. He'd done that. He'd done it his whole life, shown up for things, and then stepped back from the acknowledgement of having shown up, like the credit was beside the point, and only the act mattered. She'd argued with him about it sometimes. She'd told him that people needed to know when they'd been helped, needed to be able to say thank you, and he'd always looked at her with that mild expression that wasn't quite disagreement and said, "They know. They'll carry it. That's enough." She understood it differently now. standing here with his compass back in her hands and a stranger telling her about the last hours she'd never been able to imagine properly. Not because it changed what she'd believed about him, but because believing and knowing were different things, the way she'd told Elliot they were. And she'd been carrying the weight of not knowing for 8 years. And something about the weight had just changed, not lifted. Changed. Which was not the same thing, but was not nothing either. She became aware that Elliot was watching her. Not pushing, not prompting us, just watching. The way she'd noticed he watched things, with the quiet patience of someone who built and restored objects for a living and had learned that not everything could be rushed. He was right, she said, eventually. About what? About stepping back. She looked at the compass in her hand. I used to think he did it because he was modest. I think he did it because the act itself was the thing that mattered to him and everything after was just noise. She paused. He used to say that a good deed doesn't need an audience. I found it very annoying. Elliot's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Yeah, I can see how that would be. He was right, though, obviously. She glanced at him. He'd probably love knowing that the necklace ended up with someone who actually needed it. I'm not sure I needed it. You've been wearing it for 7 years. Elliot said nothing. What does it mean to you? Vivian asked. If you had to say. He looked at it, at the pendant resting against his chest, for a long moment. That night on the mountain, he said slowly, I was in a bad place. Not the road, not the accident. I mean, in my life. My wife had died 14 months before. I was running on fumes and holding everything together mostly because my daughter needed me to, and that was the whole story of my days. Just get through it. Don't fall apart. Lily needs you to not fall apart. He paused. And then that night happened. A stranger showed up in the middle of a storm and worked beside me and saved my life and didn't ask for a thing, didn't even leave his name. And I thought about that for a long time afterward. About what kind of person does something like that. He looked at Vivian. The kind of person I wanted to be, he said, for Lily. So she'd grow up knowing what that looked like, what it actually looked like in a person. Not just told to be good, shown. He touched the pendant briefly. I kept the necklace because it reminded me of that, of the standard. Vivian was quiet. The wind had picked up slightly, and Lily made a sound of protest in her sleep, and Elliot shifted her more firmly against his shoulder without looking, the adjustment entirely automatic. The ribbon in her hair drifted loose and fell, and Vivian caught it without thinking and tucked it into her jacket pocket without mentioning it. He'd have liked you, Vivian said. I never met him. You met him exactly once. He put his shoulder against a car and braced it so you could pull a door open, and then he tackled you out of the way of a landslide, and then he disappeared. She looked at Elliot. Trust me, he'd have liked you. Elliot looked at her for a moment, and she could see in his face something settling, something that had maybe been unsettled for a long time finding a place to rest. From inside the ballroom, faintly, the sound of the event's program beginning, a microphone, applause, the bright social noise of 500 people performing philanthropy. Neither of them moved toward it. I have a photograph, Elliot said. Vivian looked at him. From after. When the ambulance came and everything was being dealt with. There was a guy in the work crew, a few days later, who'd taken a picture at the original scene. I didn't know about it at the time. He sent it to the sheriff's office as part of the documentation. He shifted carefully, reaching into his jacket pocket without disturbing Lily, and produced his phone. A few taps. He turned the screen toward her. The photograph was grainy and dark. A phone camera in bad rain on a mountain road, the kind of image that shouldn't show much of anything. But the emergency vehicle lights had arrived just before it was taken, and the red and blue caught the scene in fragments. 2 men near what was left of the station wagon. Elliot, younger, his shirt soaked and his arm wrapped in what looked like a torn piece of fabric, talking to someone Vivian assumed was the paramedic. And beside him, slightly apart, not part of the conversation, a larger figure, turned partly away from the camera, preparing to leave. Dark jacket, the kind of broad-shouldered build that had been familiar to her across 15 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days. You couldn't see his face, but she knew how he stood. She knew the set of his shoulders in the rain. That's him, she said. It wasn't a question. That's him, Elliot confirmed. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she handed the phone back and she pressed her palm flat against the cold railing, and she stood there in the October night looking at the city that Nathaniel had never stopped loving. And something in the architecture of her grief, which had stood unchanged for 8 years, immovable, load-bearing, shifted. Not collapsed, not resolved, just shifted, the way a river shifts when something moves in its bed. Still the same river, but running along a slightly different line. She'd spent 8 years thinking his last moments were lost, unknowable. A gap in the record she'd have to carry forever. She knew differently now. He'd been on a mountain road in a storm, and he'd seen something that needed doing, and he'd done it, and he'd walked away without waiting for the credits. He'd been exactly himself right to the end. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. "Thank you," she said quietly, to Elliot, to the photograph, to the city, to no one in particular. "For keeping it." Elliot nodded. The wind moved through the terrace, and Lily sighed in her sleep, and the compass rested against Elliot's chest, catching the light. They stayed on the terrace longer than either of them intended. That was the thing about conversations that cracked something open. They had their own gravity. You couldn't just decide to walk back inside and return to the sparkling water and the small talk and the performance of the evening as though nothing had shifted. The room was still there. The Kellerman Foundation people were still waiting somewhere near the east wall. Dana was probably scanning the crowd with that particular focused expression she got when she needed to locate Vivian and couldn't. None of that felt as immediate as it should have. Lily woke up properly around 10:15. Not gradually. She went from asleep to alert in about 4 seconds, the way children do, like someone had thrown a switch. She lifted her head, looked at Vivian with the frank evaluating stare she'd deployed briefly before falling back asleep, and then looked at her father. "I'm hungry," she announced. "You're always hungry," Elliot said. "That's because you forget to feed me." "I fed you 2 hours ago." "That was a long time ago." She turned to Vivian with the easy social confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious. "Do you work here?" "I'm a guest," Vivian said. "Like you." Lily considered this. "There's little food on trays. The man with the tray gave me one that had cheese and something green." "Did you eat the green thing?" "No," Lily said without guilt. Something about the exchange, its complete ordinariness, the way it existed in a different register than everything that had just passed between the adults, did something unexpected to Vivian's chest. Not sadness, exactly. More like the feeling of stepping from one temperature into another. "Let's go find the tray man," Elliot said. He glanced at Vivian. "Will you?" "Yes," she said. "I'll come." It was not what she'd planned. She had not planned any of this evening, which was unusual for her. Vivian's life ran largely on planning, on the structure of intention, because she'd learned early that without it, the things she was building had a tendency to list in directions she didn't want. But here she was, following a man she'd met 40 minutes ago and his small daughter through the corridors of the Hargrove Grand, looking for a waiter with a cheese tray, and the evening felt less like something she was navigating and more like something she was simply inside of. They found a quiet corner of the ballroom's side gallery, a narrower room off the main floor that had been set up with high tables and was currently less crowded, the noise from the main event reduced to something manageable. Elliot found Lily a chair and a plate from one of the side tables, and she settled in with the focused seriousness of a person who had important eating to do. "How did you end up here tonight?" Vivian asked. She'd settled across the table, her jacket over the back of the chair, the compass no longer in her hand. She'd given it back, and it rested against his chest, and she was getting used to looking at it there, which was a strange thing to notice about herself. "The gala." "My client," Elliot said. "Richard Hale. He does construction, commercial mostly, and he restores old buildings on the side. He had me restore a pair of arts and crafts library cases for him last year, and we kept in touch. He had an extra ticket, and his wife couldn't make it, and he said I should get out of the workshop for a night." A pause. "He didn't mention the dress code as forcefully as he probably should have." Vivian looked at the navy blazer. "It's a good blazer. It's a 7-year-old blazer. It holds up. I take care of things," he said. It was a simple statement, not a boast, and it landed differently because of that. She believed it. She believed it looking at Lily, who was methodically working through a plate of food with the unhurried attention of a child who'd been taught that dinner was worth the time it took. She believed it looking at the blazer and at the compass and at the quality of attention he'd given her story and his own story both during those 40 minutes on the terrace. "What did you restore?" she asked. "Before the library cases." He talked about his work the way people talk about things they genuinely love and are slightly embarrassed about loving, with careful understatement, as though too much enthusiasm might sound naive. He'd started in carpentry during high school, picked up furniture restoration from a man named Gerald Bauer, who ran a shop out of a converted dairy barn in upstate New York, and who had the patience of a person who operated on a geological timescale. Gerald had taught him that restoration was not about returning something to what it looked like new. It was about returning it to what it actually was, which was different. New things were finished, restored things had a history, and the history was part of the object, and your job was to understand the history before you touched anything. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Vivian said. "He died 4 years ago. Heart attack in the barn, working on a shaker sideboard. His wife said he'd have wanted it that way." Elliot looked at his glass. "I believed her." "How long did you work for him?" 3 years. Then I went out on my own. I was 22. A slight pause. "Gerald said I was ready. I wasn't entirely sure he was right, but I wasn't going to argue with Gerald." Lily, who had apparently finished the main business of eating and had graduated to listening, looked up at this. "Gerald was nice," she said. Elliot looked at her. "You never met Gerald." "You told me about him." "That's not the same thing." "He sounds nice," she said, with the certainty of a child who has developed strong opinions about people she's never encountered. Vivian smiled. It surprised her. Not the smile itself, but the completeness of it. The way it involved her whole face rather than just the socially appropriate portion. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened at one of these events. "She's right," Vivian said. "He sounds nice." Elliot looked between them with an expression of mild, outnumbered resignation. He was cantankerous, cheap, and told the same 4 stories on rotation for 3 years. "And nice," Lily confirmed. "And nice," he conceded. The side gallery was emptying slightly as the program in the main room drew people back. The noise level shifted. More applause, more microphone, the organized pulse of an event reaching its fundraising portion. Vivian registered it and filed it away and didn't move. She was looking at Elliot and thinking, with the part of her brain that assessed situations, the part she couldn't turn off, the part that had built and protected and defended a company for 11 years and had kept it together through the worst of what losing Nathaniel had done to her, that she didn't entirely know what she was doing here. Sitting with this man and his daughter in a side gallery when she had obligations and a schedule, and Dana somewhere in the crowd with a list of people who needed her attention. She knew what she was doing here. That was the problem. She was doing it because this man had spent 7 years carrying the last evidence of who her husband had been at the end, and he'd carried it with intention and care and without knowing what it meant, and that was not a thing she could walk away from in an evening and file under closed. "You said you were in a bad place," she said. "That night on the mountain." He glanced at her, then at Lily, who was constructing something with the remaining food on her plate that seemed to require architectural concentration. He seemed to make a calculation. "Yeah," he said. "Sarah," Vivian said, not asking. She'd registered the name from earlier, placed it. 14 months before the storm, a driver ran a red light and hit her car on the passenger side. His voice was flat, not because he was without feeling, but because the flatness was the shape grief takes after enough repetitions. "She died before the ambulance got there. I was at work. I got the call in the parking lot." Vivian said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and she'd been on the receiving end of enough useless condolences to know that silence was almost always the better choice. "Lily was 11 months old," Elliot said. "I kept thinking, she's not going to remember her. She's going to grow up, and she will not have one memory of her mother's face. Not one." He stopped, picked up his glass, put it down without drinking. That was the thing that was hardest. Not even for me. For her. Does she know about her? Everything I can tell her. He glanced at Lily, who had graduated from food architecture to looking around the room with the comprehensive survey of a small person cataloging a new environment. I talk about her all the time. I show her pictures. I kept some of her things. Her jewelry, a few books she loved, a sweater Lily wears sometimes even though it doesn't fit right yet. I want her to know who her mother was. A pause. I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything is enough for that particular gap. It's not, Vivian said, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. He looked at her. I lost my parents when I was 9, she said. Car accident, same as yours. Different circumstances, but same category. I went to my aunt's, and she was a decent woman who did what she could. She didn't have pictures, she didn't tell stories. She thought the kindest thing was to move forward. A pause. She was wrong, and I've spent 30 years knowing she was wrong, and I've never entirely figured out how to fix what that cost me. She looked at Elliot directly. What you're doing for Lily? That's not nothing. That's the whole thing, actually. He held her gaze for a moment. How do you know? It might not take. She might grow up and none of it. It takes, Vivian said. Children know when they're being told the truth about people. They know when someone loves the person they're being told about. That comes through. A beat. You're not what I expected, Elliot said. What did you expect? He gestured slightly at the room, the event, the marble, the implicit context of the Hargrove Grand Charity Gala, and the kind of person who was expected to be at home in it. He didn't say it, but he didn't need to. Nobody expects me to be what I am, Vivian said. I gave up being irritated about it around year 6. When did you start building the company? Officially, 26. Unofficially, I'd been building it since I was 19 and working 3 jobs to put myself through school. She paused. Nathaniel thought I was insane for the first 2 years. Then he thought I was right, and he'd been wrong, and he could not apologize for that fast enough, which was very Nathaniel. He was spectacularly capable of admitting he was wrong. It's a quality I miss in most people. What was the company? Healthcare logistics, moving medical supplies and equipment more efficiently through systems that were built to be inefficient. She could hear herself slipping into the practiced language she used for interviews and presentations, and she pulled back from it deliberately. Basically, I kept getting angry about the fact that hospitals couldn't get what they needed when they needed it, and nobody seemed to find that as unacceptable as I did, so I built something to fix it. You got angry and built a company. It's a pattern with me. Elliot looked at her with that quality of attention he had, the one that didn't feel like an assessment so much as a kind of genuine interest. Were you angry when Nathaniel died? It was not a question most people would have asked. Most people, if they'd arrived at this point in the conversation at all, would have kept a careful distance from it, offering only the established vocabulary of sympathy, the words that acknowledged loss without touching it directly. Elliot asked it the way he seemed to do most things, with the directness of someone who'd decided that dancing around the actual thing was more trouble than it was worth. Vivian considered it honestly. I was angry for about 6 months, she said. At the mountain rescue team for letting him be on a route alone in that weather, at the storm, at the structural condition of the mountain road which hadn't been properly assessed since 1987. A pause. At Nathaniel, for about 2 weeks, which I felt terrible about and which was also apparently completely normal, according to the grief therapist I eventually saw. Angry at him for dying. Angry at him for being exactly who he was in the exact wrong moment. She let out a breath. He had a complete inability to not act. If he saw something that needed doing, the idea of not doing it was physically uncomfortable to him. He was constitutionally incapable of looking away. A pause. That's what got him killed, and it's also the thing I most loved about him, and I've spent 8 years not being able to separate those two facts into anything that made clean sense. Elliot was quiet for a moment. Maybe they don't separate, he said. She looked at him. Maybe they're the same fact, he said. The thing that made him him, and the thing that... He stopped. I don't know. I just think sometimes the things we love most about people are the same things that make them hard to hold. Sarah was the most generous person I ever knew. She couldn't say no to anyone. She was running an errand for a neighbor the day she died. He said the last part without flinching, matter of fact. I spent a long time trying to figure out how to be angry at her generosity. I couldn't do it. So I was just angry, and it had nowhere to land, and eventually it ran out. Vivian looked at the compass resting against his chest. That's what the necklace was, she said slowly. A place for something to land. He thought about it. Yeah, maybe. A standard, you said. A standard. He touched the pendant briefly, the same unconscious gesture she'd seen him make on the terrace. After Sarah died, I had a while where I was just getting through. You know what that looks like. Wake up, get Lily fed, get to the workshop, get through the hours, get Lily to bed, sleep badly, wake up and do it again. Nothing wrong with any of it exactly. It kept us going, but I wasn't particularly... He searched for the word. Present. I was functional. There's a difference. There is, Vivian agreed. The night on the mountain. I don't know exactly what it did. It wasn't a cure for anything. I'm not saying that. But it reminded me that there were things I could do that were worth doing, that were bigger than just getting through. He looked at the pendant. The man I worked beside that night didn't owe anything to a car crash on a mountain road. He was just there. He just acted. A pause. I wanted to be that. Not heroic specifically. I don't think it's about that. Just present. Just paying attention to what's actually in front of you and doing what it needs. Lily had migrated off her chair at some point during this and was now standing next to Elliot, leaning against his arm with the easy physical familiarity of a child who'd never had cause to doubt that she was welcome there. She was looking at Vivian with interest. My dad makes things, Lily said. It seemed like a contribution to the conversation she'd decided to make. I know, Vivian said. He told me. He fixes things that are old. He made me a box. Lily held her hands apart to indicate a size, a shoebox, roughly, with flowers on it, for my special things. What do you keep in it? Lily thought about this with great seriousness. A rock that is pretty. 3 letters from my teacher when I was in the other school, a photograph of my mom, a slight pause, and a tooth I lost that was very bloody. The tooth is important, Vivian said, keeping a completely straight face. Very important, Lily confirmed. Elliot pressed his mouth together briefly in the way of a parent managing an expression in front of their child. She takes the box very seriously, he said, as she should. Lily had apparently said what she needed to say and drifted back toward the table, examining the remains of her plate. Vivian watched her and thought about the box with flowers, the care that went into making it, the deliberateness of the gift. A father giving his daughter a safe place to keep the things she couldn't afford to lose. She thought about Nathaniel's compass, about what it meant that the last object he'd touched, practically speaking, the last thing from his body that had survived the mountain, had ended up on the chest of a man like this. A man who understood what it meant to hold things carefully. Can I ask you something? She said. You've been asking me things for an hour, Elliot said. I think we're past needing permission. Fair. She looked at him steadily. Why didn't you ever move? After Sarah died? Upstate is far from anything. It seems like it would have been lonely. The question sat there for a moment. She could see him deciding how to answer it, not evasively, but with the deliberate care of someone who wanted to get the answer right rather than just give one. I thought about it, he said. A lot, in the first year. Move somewhere closer to people. More opportunity, easier access to everything, just easier. My mother-in-law wanted us to come to Portland where she lived. She had a good argument for it. A pause. But the workshop was there. Gerald built it in 1971, and it smells like 50 years of wood and varnish, and the heating is terrible, and the floor slopes in 2 places. And when I'm in it working on something difficult, I feel like, I don't know, like there's a place where I fit. Lily grew up in that house. Sarah's buried 20 minutes away. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere. I understand that, Vivian said. And she did, in a way she couldn't have when she was younger. The understanding of how much a place can hold, how much meaning accumulates in the specific arrangement of a floor that slopes in 2 places. She'd kept the apartment she and Nathaniel had shared until 3 years ago, long past the point when it made practical sense. Her building people had been very quiet about it, and Dana had been quiet about it, and she'd ignored everyone until she was ready, and then she'd moved. She still drove past it sometimes. I have a house, she said, not entirely sure why she was telling him this. In Westfield. Big house. 6 bedrooms. I have not used 5 of them in 8 years. A pause. Nathaniel wanted a big house because he grew up in a big family and loved the noise of it. I grew up in a small apartment and was not entirely sure what 6 bedrooms would do for us. We had one argument about it that lasted 3 weeks. She almost smiled. He won. He was right. The house it's a good house. It was a good house when it was full. Elliot was looking at her carefully. Do you have people around? I have Donna. I have a board of 12 who require varying degrees of management. I have colleagues and professional connections and people who need things from me in a fairly constant stream. She paused. Not the same thing. No, he said, not the same thing. The program in the main room had apparently reached some kind of apex. There was a sustained wave of applause, the kind that meant either a big donation had been announced or someone had said something that required a standing ovation. Vivian registered it distantly. I want to show you something, she said. She reached into her jacket pocket, not for her phone, but for the other things she always carried to events like this, a habit she'd developed 3 years ago when she'd realized that carrying something of Nathaniel's made these rooms more tolerable. It was a photograph, printed on good paper, kept in a small protective sleeve. She set it on the table. It was a picture of Nathaniel in the memorial garden behind the Ashford house, the garden she'd planted the year after he died, when she needed something living to put her hands into. He was sitting on the bench near the rosemary hedge, laughing at something outside the frame, his head tilted back, entirely unselfconscious. The compass was visible at his collar. Elliot picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. That's him, he said. Yes. I couldn't see his face in the photograph from the mountain. The angle was wrong. He held the picture carefully. This is... He stopped. Take your time, Vivian said. He looked at the photograph for another moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, quieter, with something underneath it that wasn't grief but was adjacent to it. He was bigger than he looked, Elliot said. In the photograph from the road, I mean. In person, he seemed, I don't know, very solid. Not physically, necessarily, though physically too. Just solid in a way that made you feel like whatever was happening was going to be handled. A pause. I don't know how to explain that better. You don't need to, Vivian said. I know exactly what you mean. He set the photograph down gently. She picked it up and put it back in its sleeve and back in her pocket, next to the hair ribbon she'd caught from Lily's hair without thinking. Across the table, Lily had found a cloth napkin and was in the process of making something with it, a project she was undertaking with great focus and no apparent plan. Vivian watched her fold and refold, seriously committed to a shape that kept not working. What are you making? Vivian asked. Lily looked up. A bird. How's it going? Lily considered the napkin honestly. Not good, she said. Do you want help? Lily considered Vivian with similar honesty. Then she slid the napkin across the table. Vivian's aunt had taught her exactly one useful thing in the years she'd spent in her house, and it was paper folding, origami technically, but in the form of napkins and whatever else was available, a skill her aunt had picked up from a woman she'd worked with in a laundry years before Vivian arrived, and which she deployed on slow evenings. Vivian hadn't thought about it in years. Her hands remembered it anyway. She worked the napkin in silence, making a series of folds, and Lily watched with the focused attention of a child tracking a magic trick. After 2 minutes, Vivian set a reasonable approximation of a bird on the table. Not a masterpiece. The wing angles were slightly off, but clearly a bird. Lily picked it up and looked at it from multiple angles. That's a bird, she said, with the decisive certainty of official judgment. It is. Lily looked at Vivian differently after that. Some reclassification had occurred. Elliot was watching the exchange with an expression Vivian couldn't quite read. It wasn't sadness. She didn't think it was sadness. It was something more complicated, something that might have had several things in it at once, and she didn't think it was her business to name them. Tell me about the restoration work, she said. What you're working on now. He seemed grateful for the question. He described a project he'd taken on 6 weeks earlier. A dining table from around 1890, mahogany, American, family piece that had been badly refinished in the 1960s with something industrial that had yellowed and cracked and penetrated in ways that were going to take weeks to properly reverse. The original finish, underneath, was still intact in places. The bones of the thing were solid. It was a matter of patience, mostly, of not rushing the chemistry, of letting each layer do what it needed to do before moving to the next. People always want to speed it up, he said. They bring something in and they think there's a procedure you follow, steps, a recipe. And there is, for simple stuff. But the real work doesn't go faster than it goes. You learn to be comfortable with that, or you don't last. You've learned to be comfortable with it. I've learned to be less uncomfortable with it, he corrected. I'm still impatient. I'm just better at not showing it to the furniture. Vivian smiled at that. Another one of those full-face smiles that she was beginning to stop cataloging as unusual. Outside the gallery windows, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent to the Hargrove Gala and the people performing inside it, and the two people who'd stopped performing somewhere around the second hour. The night had gotten colder. Vivian could see it in the condensation on the glass. I've taken up too much of your evening, Elliot said. It wasn't an exit, exactly. More of an offering, an acknowledgement that she had reasons to be here that didn't involve him. You haven't, she said. Which was true and also not entirely the point. The point, she was beginning to understand, was something that operated at a different level than the transactional social exchange she'd expected this evening to be. She'd come to this gala for pediatric hospital programs and the Kellerman Foundation and the performance of being Vivian Ashford in public. She'd found something she hadn't known she was missing, which was a man who'd known her husband only for the span of a storm on a mountain road, and who'd carried the evidence of that knowing for 7 years, and who understood what it meant to take care of things. She was not certain yet what to do with that understanding. She was certain enough that she didn't want to dismiss it. I want to show you something, she said for the second time that evening. Not tonight, but there's a garden on the property in Westfield. She paused. I planted it for Nathaniel after he died. There's a bench and the rosemary is about 8 feet tall at this point, which is not what I intended, and there's a photograph mounted by the gate. She stopped, organized what she was trying to say. I think you should see it, you and Lily. Another pause. I think he'd have wanted the two of you to know each other, in whatever way that makes sense. Elliot was quiet. That's a strange thing to say, she acknowledged. It is, he agreed. It's also not wrong. Lily had been listening with the selective attention of a 5-year-old who is pretending not to listen and is actually catching most of it. She looked up from the napkin bird, which she'd been examining in various orientations. Is there a garden? She asked. A big one, Vivian said. With flowers? And rosemary. It smells like a lot, actually. It's aggressive rosemary. Lily seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to the bird. Elliot looked at Vivian for a moment, and she could see him doing the thing he did, the actual looking, the real assessing. And she let him, because she'd stopped performing at some point in the last 2 hours and wasn't sure she could have picked it back up convincingly anyway. Okay, he said. And then, because he seemed constitutionally unable to say things he didn't mean, I'd like that. Dana found her 20 minutes later, appearing in the doorway of the side gallery with the expression of a person who has been looking for someone for 45 minutes and has practiced not being irritated about it. The Kellerman people have been waiting, she said, carefully neutral. I know, tell them 10 minutes. Vivian stood. She looked at Elliot. I have to go do the thing I came here to do. Yeah. He stood as well, Lily immediately reaching for his hand. Me too, I think. They exchanged numbers with the practicality of two people who have arrived at the obvious conclusion that a conversation has not ended, only paused. Dana watched this with the professional inscrutability of someone who had learned to observe without commenting, though Vivian caught the slight shift in her expression that meant she was filing it away. At the doorway of the side gallery, Vivian stopped. Elliot. He turned. She almost said something about Nathaniel, about what it meant to have found him, to have found the compass, to have been given this accounting of an evening 8 years ago that she'd thought was lost. She had several true things she could have said, and none of them felt like the right shape for this particular doorway, this particular moment. "The napkin bird," she said. "Tell me if Lily approves of it when she gets home." A pause. Then something in his face relaxed, not into happiness exactly, but into something easier than what had been there before. Something that was on the way. "She will," he said. "She has good taste." Vivian nodded. She followed Dana back into the current of the evening, back into the marble and the chandeliers and the 500 people and the Kellerman Foundation people who'd been waiting patiently near the east wall. She took a glass of sparkling water and shook the right hands and said the appropriate things and raised a meaningful amount of money for pediatric hospital programs, as she'd come here to do. And in her jacket pocket, the whole time, she was aware of two things: the photograph in its protective sleeve and the ribbon from Lily's hair that she'd caught without thinking and tucked away and was still carrying, its small silk weight a reminder that the evening had held something she hadn't expected to find and wasn't ready to let go of yet. She didn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual exactly. Vivian had a complicated relationship with sleep that predated Nathaniel's death and had simply gotten more complicated afterward. But this was a different kind of wakefulness than the ordinary kind. This wasn't anxiety running loops or her brain rehearsing tomorrow's problems. This was something more like being too full, the way you feel after a meal you didn't expect to need as badly as you did. Her body was tired. Her mind had other plans. She sat in the kitchen of the Westfield house at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea she'd stopped drinking and the photograph of Nathaniel on the table in front of her. The house was very quiet at this hour. 6 bedrooms, all empty except hers. And the silence had a particular quality in a house this size. Not the tight silence of a small space, but something more expansive, the kind that seemed to have room in it for things that weren't there anymore. She turned the photograph toward her. He was laughing in it. She'd taken it on a Sunday morning in September, 3 weeks before he died, and she remembered the moment clearly. She'd said something sarcastic about the state of the garden, and he'd found it genuinely funny, the full-body laugh that always looked slightly undignified, and that she'd loved for exactly that reason. He hadn't known she'd taken the picture. He never liked photographs of himself when he was aware of them. In the ones he'd posed for, there was always a slight performance, a mild self-consciousness that flattened him somehow. The real ones, the ones where he forgot he was being seen, were the ones that looked like him. She thought about what Elliot had said. Very solid. Not physically, necessarily, though physically too. Just solid in a way that made you feel like whatever was happening was going to be handled. She'd tried to explain Nathaniel to people before, with limited success. He wasn't the kind of person who was easy to convey in summary. His qualities were not the impressive kind. Not charismatic, not especially witty, not the person who commanded a room. But in a crisis or in a conversation, or in any situation that required someone to simply be present and reliable, he was the most competent human being she'd ever known. Not because he performed competence, but because he genuinely decided, at some point early in his life, that if something needed doing, standing around assessing his qualifications was a waste of time. You moved toward the problem. You did what you could. You didn't wait to be certain. A man she'd never met had described this quality accurately after spending one storm-dark hour working beside him on a mountain road, and that accuracy sat in her chest like something warm and something sharp at the same time. She put the photograph away. She picked up her phone, found the number she'd saved under the name Elliot Mercer, and looked at it for a moment without doing anything. Then she put the phone face down on the table and finished her cold tea and went to bed. She didn't text him that night. She texted him 3 days later, which was 4 days sooner than she'd told herself she would. The message said, "The garden. Saturday, if that works. Bring Lily." His reply came 4 minutes later, which she noticed and said nothing about. "Works for us. What time?" 2 o'clock. I'll send the address." "Okay." And then, after a pause that was exactly long enough for her to start doing something else. "She's still talking about the bird." Vivian looked at that for a moment. Then she put her phone in her desk drawer and went back to work, and she did not look at it again for at least 20 minutes, which she considered a reasonable performance of self-possession. The Saturday was cold and clear, the kind of November day that couldn't decide if it was still fall or had already committed to winter. The garden looked the way it always looked this time of year. Stripped back, the rosemary enormous and silver green, the beds cleared down to the dark soil, the bench near the back with its weathered teak gone gray. She'd had Marcus, who managed the property, clear the fallen leaves from the paths the day before, not because she was trying to make it look impressive, but because the paths were easier to walk when you could see them. She was in the kitchen when the truck arrived. She heard it before she saw it, an older truck, the engine distinctive, pulling to a stop on the gravel drive. She looked out the window. Navy blue truck, dented along the rear passenger panel in the way of vehicles that are used for actual work. She watched Elliot get out on the driver's side and Lily appear from the passenger door, jumping the distance to the gravel without apparent concern about the drop, landing in a crouch and then straightening up and looking around at the property with comprehensive interest. She was wearing a bright orange coat. Vivian could see it from the window with complete clarity. In the gray November light, it was the most intensely colored thing in the landscape. She went to the front door. "You found it," she said. "GPS," Elliot said, and the gate was pretty clear. He looked different out of the navy blazer. More himself, Vivian thought, in the way that people sometimes look more like who they actually are in their everyday clothes than in their dressed-up versions. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, dark green, broken in at the elbows, jeans, boots that had seen serious use. He had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the house with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely interested in old buildings. 1912, Vivian said. He nodded, studying the roofline. Craftsman influence, the porch brackets. Nathaniel spent 6 months researching the history of it before we bought it. I thought he was being excessive. Was he? He was not, she admitted. Lily had already moved past both of them toward the side of the house, drawn by something Vivian couldn't yet see from the doorway. Then she heard it, the sound from the far edge of the property, the low territorial sound of Marcus's old tabby cat, who had lived in the garden shed for 11 years and regarded visitors with constitutional suspicion. "Lily," Elliot said, without alarm, but with the practiced forward attention of a parent who has learned to track a child's trajectory. "There's a cat," Lily called back. She had not stopped moving toward it. "The cat does not necessarily want to be found," Vivian said. "That's what makes it interesting," Lily explained, disappearing around the corner of the house. Elliot looked at Vivian. "She'll be fine. The cat will hide." The cat has 11 years of practice hiding from curious things. They went around the side of the house together, following Lily's orange coat through the gate in the stone wall that separated the drive from the garden proper. The garden opened up beyond it, larger than it appeared from outside the wall, laid out on a gentle slope that Vivian had learned to work with rather than fight against. The rosemary hedge dominated the upper section, spilling slightly over the stone border it was theoretically contained by. Below it, the cleared beds. The apple tree in the far corner, bare now, its branches making their own logic against the sky. And at the center, the bench, and beside the gate through which they'd just come, the wooden mounting that held the photograph in its weather-proofed frame. Elliot saw it immediately. It wasn't the same photograph she'd shown him at the gala. That one was the candid shot, the Sunday morning laugh. This one was older. It showed Nathaniel standing at the garden gate in what must have been late spring, arms crossed, squinting slightly against the light, caught mid-word. The garden was only half planted behind him. She'd taken this in the first year after his death, when she was still building it, when she'd wanted a record of what it looked like before it became what it became. She'd had it enlarged and mounted because this version of him, mid-sentence, impatient, slightly irritated at something, entirely unself-conscious, felt like the truest one she had. Elliot stood in front of it for a moment. "How long did it take?" he asked. "To build the garden." "The first version, about a year. The rosemary happened on its own." She looked at the hedge. "I planted 4 small ones along the border. I didn't realize how aggressively they'd go if you let them. By year 3, they were already ridiculous. Did you consider cutting them back?" "Once. Then I decided they'd earned it." He looked at the photograph again. Then he turned and looked at the garden. The whole of it, taking it in the way he'd looked at the house, with that genuine engagement with the physical facts of a thing. "He would have liked this," Elliot said. "He suggested it," Vivian said. "He didn't mean for it to be a memorial. He meant for it to be a garden. He kept saying the back property was doing nothing and we should put something in it. She paused. We kept not getting around to it. After he died, I needed something to do with my hands. Elliot nodded. He understood that kind of need. She could see it in the way he received the information, without the slight, uncertain sympathy of people who hadn't been there. From somewhere in the direction of the shed, Lily let out a triumphant sound that suggested she had located the cat. Should we? Elliot started. Marcus is out there, Vivian said. He'll make sure she's okay. And the cat has never actually hurt anyone. It just makes a great deal of noise about the possibility. They walked slowly down the center path toward the bench. The gravel was damp from the night before and crunched differently for it. Vivian had walked this path more times than she could count. Alone, mostly, sometimes with Dana, once with a journalist who'd wanted to write about her philanthropic work and whom she'd brought out here probably as a way of testing whether the person could be trusted with something real. The journalist had talked too much, and she'd known immediately that the answer was no. Elliot walked quietly. She appreciated that. They sat on the bench. The angle from it looked back up the garden toward the gate and the photograph and the house beyond. Nathaniel had chosen the placement of the bench. She'd had it installed where he always stood when he talked about the garden. The spot he'd returned to repeatedly, the natural center of his vision for what the space could be. I've been thinking, Vivian said. About what you said. About the standard. She looked at the photograph by the gate, visible from here as a small rectangle of gray-framed image. When Nathaniel died, I spent the first year trying to make sense of what his life had added up to. You do that, I think. You make the accounting. What did all of it mean, everything he did? Where did it go when he was gone? She paused. The conclusion I came to was that he'd done well, that the accounting was positive, and then I put it away because you can't live inside someone else's life summary indefinitely. But, Elliot said, but I put the question away before I had all the information. She looked at him sideways. I didn't know about the mountain. I didn't know about you, and now I do. And I'm recalculating. He waited. He saved a family on a mountain road in a storm, she said, and then he walked away without leaving his name. And a few hours later, somewhere on that same mountain, he died doing the same thing, responding to something that needed responding to. And no one knew he'd been there. The full accounting of his last day was invisible. She stopped. That bothered me more than I knew how to say for 8 years. The fact that he might have spent his last hours doing something extraordinary, and the record just lost it. It wasn't lost, Elliot said quietly. I know that now. She clasped her hands in her lap. You were the record. He said nothing. You kept it, she said, without knowing what you were keeping. You carried the evidence that his last day was entirely consistent with every other day of his life, and you just held it for 7 years until I could find it. She shook her head slightly. I don't know what to do with that. I don't have a framework for it. Maybe it doesn't need one, Elliot said. You sound like him. Do I? He hated frameworks. He thought they were how people avoided actually feeling things. She looked at the photograph. He was also right about that, which I resented. A beat of quiet, the November garden around them, the sound of Lily somewhere in the distance having a negotiation with the cat that was clearly not going well for one of the parties. I want to tell you what it was like, Vivian said. After, if you want to hear it. I do, he said, simply. She told him. She told him about the call that came on Sunday evening, not from the rescue team, but from a state police officer with a careful voice who'd said words in a specific order that she'd understood individually, but that her brain had taken several seconds to assemble into meaning. She told him about sitting on the kitchen floor for an indeterminate amount of time after she'd hung up, not crying, just stopped, the way a machine stops when something fundamental fails. She told him about the people who came and the things they said, and how almost nothing they said was useful, not because they were wrong people, but because words were the wrong tool for the particular kind of damage she was dealing with. She told him about the investigation, the recovery, the official account, the fragmented picture of what Nathaniel had been doing on that mountain road in that storm, How the rescue team said he'd never checked in for his scheduled shift that weekend, which meant he'd been somewhere off route when he encountered the scene. How the report described evidence of a rescue attempt at the crash site, door forced open, victims moved to safety, debris cleared, but couldn't account for how or exactly when. How the team assumed he'd acted alone, because there was no evidence of anyone else, and how that version of events, Nathaniel alone on a mountain in a storm, doing exactly the thing he always did in the last hours before he died, was the version she'd lived with. They had him alone, she said, in every official version, and I believed it because there was no other information, and it made sense because that was Nathaniel. He would have stopped alone. He would have worked alone. He would have done it without backup because waiting for backup meant the people in the car waited too. He wasn't alone, Elliot said. I know. She looked at him. You were there. For part of it. For the part that mattered. She paused. He saved those people, the woman and the boy, and then he pulled you out of the path of the second slide. And then he left. She stopped. I used to think about his last hours as a man walking into a situation that overwhelmed him, a good man in a bad situation, trying and not quite making it. That was the picture I had. And now? Now I have a different picture. She looked at the photograph by the gate. A man who stopped in a storm on a mountain road and worked alongside a stranger and got 3 people out of a car and saved a 4th person from a debris slide and then walked away because his work was done. And then something else happened, somewhere further along that road, and he died. But those 2 things are separate. She stopped. Before I met you, they were tangled. His death felt like the conclusion, like the whole story ended in failure because it ended in death. It didn't. No, it didn't. She was quiet for a moment. That's what you gave me, the unbundling of those 2 things. Elliot was looking at the garden. His hands rested on his knees, not quite relaxed. There was something in his posture that suggested he was managing something of his own, though what exactly she didn't know. I owe him more than I can calculate, he said. I've always known that. It was part of what made it hard to lose the necklace. A pause. Not the object, the accountability of it, the feeling that I was still paying attention to what I owed. You raised a good daughter, Vivian said. He turned his head toward her. That's where it went, she said. Whatever you felt you owed, you put it into becoming the person you told me about, the one who stays present, who pays attention. She nodded in the direction of the shed, where Lily was now audibly explaining something to the cat in a tone of patient authority. That's where it went. Elliot was quiet for a long time, long enough that a bird landed briefly on the near edge of the rosemary hedge, did whatever business brought it there, and left. She talks to everything, he said finally. Animals, the furniture I'm working on, the truck when it doesn't start. She has full conversations. Does the truck respond? Sometimes, he said, when it feels like it. Vivian smiled. She's remarkable, Vivian said. She's a lot, he said, and the warmth in it was the complete and unambiguous kind. She is absolutely a lot. Lily appeared around the corner of the house at that moment, as though summoned by the subject of conversation, the orange coat vivid against the gray of the garden. She was walking with the focused purposefulness of a child who has had an experience and needs to report it. The cat was not with her. The cat is named Gerald, she announced, arriving at the bench. Vivian blinked. The cat's name is Milo. Lily considered this. I named him Gerald. He has a name. He has a new name, Lily said, with the air of someone resolving a simple misunderstanding. She sat down on the bench between them with the easy assumption of welcome that Vivian was beginning to understand was characteristic. There are apples on the ground over there. They fall from the tree in autumn, Vivian said. I should have had them cleared. They smell good. A pause. The cat smelled them too. That's how I found him. Milo, Vivian said. His name is Milo. Gerald likes apples, Lily said, looking out at the garden with satisfaction. Elliot pressed his mouth together. He met Vivian's eyes briefly over Lily's head, and in that exchange there was something that had nothing to do with the cat or the apples. a shared recognition of a small person's absolute certainty and the way that certainty made the air around it easier to breathe. Vivian stood. "I want to show you something inside," she said to Elliot. "If Lily wants to stay out—" "Gerald is in the shed," Lily said, which Vivian took to mean yes. They went inside through the back door, into the kitchen, where Vivian had left coffee on, and where the warmth of the house after the cold garden was immediate and solid. She led him through the kitchen and into the hallway, and then into the room she called the study, which was technically a sitting room, but which she'd made her own in the years since Nathaniel's death by filling it with the things she wanted around her rather than the things rooms like this were supposed to contain. There was a desk in it, bookshelves, floor to ceiling on 2 walls, a reading chair that was not elegant but was the most comfortable chair she'd ever owned and which she had no intention of replacing, and along the inside wall a long, low credenza on which she'd arranged, over 8 years, the photographs and objects that made up her accounting of Nathaniel's life. Not a shrine. She'd been careful about that, had consciously resisted the shrine, because she'd watched grief become religion in other people and understood the trap. It was more like an archive, a record. His photographs at various ages, his parents at their wedding, some of his books, the ones whose margins were filled with his handwriting, the ones that were most his, a pocket knife he'd carried since college, a bundle of letters tied with twine that she hadn't opened since she organized them, and an empty space, roughly silver dollar-sized, in the small wooden tray at the center of the credenza, where she'd put the compass the first night she'd brought it home from the gala and taken it from Elliot, and where she'd realized almost immediately that it didn't feel right there, that the object belonged elsewhere, not in a tray, not retired into archiving. And she'd taken it back the next morning and returned it to him without entirely knowing how to explain why. She pointed to the tray. Elliot saw the empty space and understood. "I want you to keep it," she said. "The compass." He looked at her. "I know I've said that before and then taken it back," she said. "I mean it now. I gave it back to you because when I put it in that tray it felt wrong, like putting it away, which felt like putting Nathaniel away, which I've never wanted to do but also have never wanted to do the way other people do it, the way that turns into something static." She looked at the credenza, at the careful arrangement of things. He was not a static person. Putting his compass in a memory tray felt like a lie about who he was. "And leaving it with me doesn't?" "Leaving it with you," she said, "means it's still out in the world, still being worn by someone who works with their hands and raises their kid alone and stops on mountain roads in storms, because apparently that's just what certain people do." She paused. "That's not a lie about who he was. That's exactly who he was." Elliot looked at the credenza for a long moment, at the photographs, the books, the empty tray. Then he reached up and unclasped the compass from his neck and held it in his palm, looking at it the way he had on the terrace, the way of someone examining not just the object, but the weight it represented. "I have something," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the canvas work jacket, which he'd kept on in the house because Vivian hadn't asked him to take it off, and produced a small envelope, not sealed. He opened it and took out a photograph, printed on regular paper, clearly copied from something older. He handed it to her. It was the photograph from the mountain road, the grainy one, taken in the emergency vehicle lights. She'd seen it on his phone at the gala, but this was a printed copy. He'd had it made, she realized, deliberately, brought it here today. "I had 2 copies made," he said. "One for you, one I'm keeping." She looked at the photograph, at the figure at the edge of the frame, turned partly away, those familiar shoulders, that familiar stance. "Why did you print it?" she asked. "Because I've had it on my phone for 4 years and that felt wrong," he said. "Phone photographs disappear, get lost in the scroll." He paused. "This one shouldn't get lost." She held the photograph carefully. "You said once," she said, "that you searched for the owner of the compass for 2 months and then stopped. Why 2 months specifically?" He thought about it. "Lily got sick," he said. "Nothing serious, and ear infections, the kind that just cycle through for a while and don't resolve. I spent about 3 weeks in and out of the pediatric clinic, and I was running on 4 hours of sleep, and somewhere in there the searching just fell out of the rotation." He paused. "I told myself I'd pick it back up when things settled. I didn't." Life got in the way it does, and a week became a month, became 7 years. If you'd found who it belonged to sooner, Vivian said slowly, you'd have found me. Yeah. 7 years earlier. Yeah. He looked at her. Does that... I don't know what to do with that question, she said honestly. 7 years ago, I was still in the worst of it. I don't know if I could have heard what you just told me and received it properly. I might have just... She stopped. I might have come apart. You seem pretty put together. I am now, she said. I wasn't then. She looked at the photograph in her hands. Maybe it was the right time. Now, I don't know. She paused. I try not to build too much meaning on the timing of things. It becomes a habit that's hard to argue with and easy to abuse. Practical. Nathaniel called it cold. I called it practical. We had a long-running disagreement about the difference. What would he call it now? She thought about it seriously. He'd say I was right about the distinction and wrong about which side of it I was on. She almost smiled. He was generous like that. They stood in the study for a moment, the two of them in the credenza full of Nathaniel's things, and the November light coming through the window at an angle that was going cold toward afternoon. I want to ask you something, Elliot said. And you don't have to answer. Ask. Are you okay? He said it with the bluntness of someone who'd decided that the socially calibrated version of the question was less respectful than the direct one. Not generally. Right now. This week. Since the gala. She looked at him. Nobody asked her that. Not like that. Dana asked her variants of it, but Dana's version had a professional layer that softened it. The people on her board didn't ask. The people at events like the gala didn't ask. She moved through most of her life as a person who was assumed to be managing well, because she gave every appearance of managing well, and the appearance had become so established that most people had stopped distinguishing it from the reality. I haven't slept properly since Tuesday, she said. Okay. I keep going over the story you told me. On the mountain. All the details. She paused. Not in a bad way exactly. More like, I keep checking it, making sure I have it right, like studying something that I'm afraid of misremembering. You won't misremember it. I might. Memory is not reliable. Write it down, he said simply. She looked at him. Write it down, he said again. Everything I told you in order while you have it clear. Put it somewhere safe. Then you don't have to keep holding it in your head against the possibility of losing it. It was such a practical solution that it embarrassed her slightly to not have arrived at it herself. She was a person who built systems for a living. She was a person who kept meticulous records. And she'd been lying awake at night mentally rehearsing a story because it hadn't occurred to her to simply write it down. That's very sensible, she said. I learned it from Gerald, he said. The cat or the furniture restorer? The furniture restorer. The cat I just met. He paused. Gerald Bauer kept notebooks, one per project. Everything he observed about the piece before he touched it. The damage, the original construction, what he thought had happened to it over time. So you had the full account before you started. And when you were done, the notebook was the record of what the thing actually was. A pause. He said restoration without documentation was just guessing with good intentions. Vivian looked at the credenza, at the bundle of letters, the books with Nathaniel's handwriting in the margins, the photographs, the careful material record of a person who had existed and had stopped existing and whose existence she'd been working to document properly ever since. I have been doing that, she said slowly. This whole room, that's what this is. I know, Elliot said. She was quiet for a moment, then, will you tell me again? The whole story, from the beginning, slowly. I want to write it down properly. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him deciding something. Yeah, he said. I will. They went back to the kitchen because the study felt too formal for what they were actually doing, and because the kitchen was where Vivian spent most of her actual time in the house, which made it the most honest room. She got her notebook, the kind she used for her own private records, not the business ones, and uncapped a pen, and Elliot sat across the table and began. He told it from the beginning this time, starting not at the storm but earlier, starting with the restoration job he'd been doing, the drive he'd taken, the reason he'd chosen the mountain route. He told it slowly, the way she'd asked, pausing when she was writing, giving her the details in the order they happened. The color of the station wagon, the exact position of the embankment debris, the way the other man had appeared, from which direction, what he'd said first, how he'd moved. She wrote it all down. Not everything was significant. Some of it was just the fabric of the event, the peripheral details that existed in memory but that might not add up to anything. She wrote it all down anyway, because Gerald Bauer was right that documentation before you touch something was the only way to understand what you were working with. An hour and a half into this process, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her orange coat was muddy at the knees, which she did not seem to regard as a problem. She was holding a small, flat rock. "I found this," she said, presenting it to Vivian. Vivian looked at the rock. It was gray, roughly oval, with a stripe of white quartz running through it diagonally. An ordinary garden rock elevated by specific mineral circumstance into something worth noticing. "It's beautiful," Vivian said. "You can keep it." Lily looked at the rock, then at Vivian. "Are you sure? It was in your garden." "I'm sure." "Okay." A pause. "Gerald is asleep in the shed. I put my coat over him." Elliot turned toward her. "Lily." "He looked cold." "He's a cat. He has fur." "He looked cold," she repeated, with the certainty of a child who has made an assessment and is not interested in counter-arguments. She looked at the notebook in front of Vivian, at the pages of writing. "What are you doing?" "Writing down a story," Vivian said, "about your dad, and someone he met once." Lily looked at her father, then back at Vivian. "A true story?" "Yes." "Is it a good story?" Vivian thought about that, about everything she'd written in the past 90 minutes, the slow, careful transcription of a night on a mountain road, and the chain of events that had led from that night to this kitchen table, to this child standing in a muddy coat holding a quartz-striped stone. "Yes," she said, "it's a very good story." Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to her father's side, leaning against his arm the way she did, easy and total. He put his arm around her without interrupting his train of thought, mid-sentence in the account, and kept talking, and Vivian kept writing, and the notebook filled up page by page in the November kitchen, while outside the garden held its quiet, and the cat that Lily had decided was called Gerald slept in the shed under a small orange coat, and the afternoon light went slowly gold and then dim, the way November afternoons do, without ceremony, without announcement, just the day going forward the way days do. The notebook sat on Vivian's desk for 11 days before she read it back. She wasn't avoiding it exactly. She was doing the thing she sometimes did with important things, letting them settle, the way you let a piece of wood rest after you've cut it, before you start the finish work. Elliot had explained that to her during the second visit, when he'd come back the following Saturday to fix the gate hinge that had been sticking for 3 months, and that she'd mentioned only in passing, and that he'd apparently filed away and showed up with tools for, which was a quality she'd found equal parts useful and disarming. "You don't rush the material," he'd said, crouched at the gatepost with a screwdriver. "You give it time to tell you what it needs." She'd thought about that a lot in the 11 days, about what it meant to give something time to tell you what it needed. On the 12th day, she made coffee, sat at her desk, and read the notebook from the first page. It took 2 hours. Not because it was long, say, the handwriting was dense, but the account itself was maybe 40 pages, but because she stopped frequently. Not from distress. From the opposite of distress, or something adjacent to it. From the recognition that she was reading something true, something complete, in a way that she hadn't had before. The story of Nathaniel's last day, told in Elliot's words and transcribed in her hand, sitting on the page in the particular combination of their two voices, had a quality she hadn't anticipated. It felt finished, not in the sense of being over, but in the sense of being whole. She closed the notebook and sat with her coffee, which had gone cold, and she thought about what whole meant. 8 years of carrying an incomplete account, of knowing the end of a story but not the middle, of working to accept a gap that now turned out not to be a gap at all, just information she hadn't had yet. She felt the difference in her body more than her mind. Something that had been held tight for 8 years had found a way, not to release, but to simply rest. She picked up her phone. Elliot answered on the second ring. She could hear the workshop in the background, the low sound of something mechanical, then quiet as he apparently moved away from it. "I read the notebook," she said. "Yeah?" Not pushing, just present. "I want to do something," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the gala, and I want to talk to you about it before I decide anything, because you're part of it." A pause. "Are you free this week?" A brief silence on his end. She could hear him moving, a door, then quieter. "Wednesday afternoon I could come down." "Come for dinner," she said. "Bring Lily." "She'll hold you to that." "I know." She spent the time between Sunday and Wednesday doing what she did when she was working through a problem. Not thinking about it constantly, but letting it run in the background while she did other things, checking in on it periodically the way you'd check on something that needed to cook slowly. She talked to Dana, who was both her assistant and the closest thing she had to a person who could tell her when she was wrong. Dana listened to the outline of the idea with the careful, evaluating attention she brought to everything, and then she said, "You've been wanting to do something like this for 3 years. You just didn't have a shape for it." "Do I have a shape for it now?" Dana considered. "You have the beginning of a shape." A pause. "Which is more than you had before." Wednesday came with sleet and early dark. Elliot's truck pulled up at 6, 15 minutes later than expected, which he apologized for when he came through the door, and which Vivian dismissed because traffic and sleet was not something either of them controlled. Lily was wearing the orange coat with a green hat that clashed with it in a way that achieved a kind of bold absurdity, and she had strong opinions about the sleet, which she considered personally inconsiderate. "It's cold and wet, and it's not even proper snow," she said, from inside the coat, which she was still wearing in the hallway. "That's what sleet is," Elliot said, taking it from her. "It's not pretending otherwise." "Snow would have been better." "Snow often is." Lily looked around the hallway with the familiarity of a person making a second visit to a place they've decided they like. Then she looked up at Vivian. "Is Gerald here?" "Still in the shed," Vivian said. "In this weather?" "He has a heated bed in there. He's fine." Lily looked unconvinced, but apparently decided the cat's welfare was not immediately actionable in sleet, and moved on. Vivian had made dinner herself, which was an event in the sense that she cooked maybe 40 times a year and treated each occasion with the seriousness of a project. It was nothing architectural: roast chicken, roasted vegetables, bread from the bakery 3 streets over, because she was practical about her limitations. The kind of meal that filled a kitchen with smell and made a house feel inhabited in the way that only cooking actually does. She'd been doing it for 2 hours by the time they arrived, and the kitchen had that quality of warmth that takes time to accumulate. Elliot noticed it when he came through from the hallway. He stopped for a moment in the kitchen doorway, not saying anything, just noticing. The way he noticed things. Then he set down the bag he was carrying on the counter and started to say something about the bread, and they fell into the easy back and forth of two people who have, over the course of 3 or 4 meetings, found a conversational rhythm that doesn't require much calibration. Lily ate more than seemed physically possible for a person her size. Then she asked permission to go look at the study, which Vivian gave, and they listened to her footsteps cross the hall and the sound of the study door opening, and the particular quality of quiet that meant she was looking at the photographs on the credenza with the serious attention she brought to things she considered worth examining. "She looks at things," Vivian said. "Always has." Elliot turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She'll sit in front of a piece I'm working on for 20 minutes. Not touching, just looking. I don't know where she got it. Maybe from watching you." He looked at her. "You look at things," Vivian said. "You look at things the way people look when they're actually trying to understand them, not just see them. She's probably been watching that since she could see." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of someone receiving something they weren't sure they'd earned. "I want to tell you the idea," Vivian said. "Okay." She'd spent the days since Sunday organizing it in her head, finding the right order for the parts, separating what was clear from what was still unresolved. She laid it out for him the way she'd learned to lay out ideas, starting with the problem, then the intention, then the specific shape she was thinking. The problem: she'd been looking for a way to do something meaningful with the Ashford name and the Ashford money that wasn't just another donation vehicle, another foundation check-writing operation, another tax-efficient way for wealthy people to feel better about having wealth. She'd run those. They did some good. They also had a quality of distance that bothered her. The money moved, but the people with the money stayed exactly where they were, looking at the problem from the same remove they'd always occupied. The intention? Something connected to what Nathaniel had actually been and what Elliot had actually done. Something about the specific quality of showing up, of practical help given without fanfare to people who needed it, not in the abstract, but in the immediate and specific form of someone sitting beside them and working. The shape. A foundation for single parents. Not grants, or not only grants. That was too passive, too transactional. Skills programming. Real skills, practical ones, the kind that made people more capable of building their own stability. Mentorship by people who had done it themselves, not people who'd read about it. A way to connect the people who'd found a way through difficult things with the people who were still in the middle of them. She stopped. Elliot was looking at her steadily. "And Nathaniel fits into this how?" he said. Not dismissively, genuinely asking, working out the structure. "He spent 11 years volunteering with the mountain rescue team," she said. "Nobody paid him, nobody asked him to. He just decided that he had capacity to help in a specific way, and he showed up and did it, repeatedly, without ceremony." She paused. "That's the model I keep coming back to, not charity as transaction, help as a practice, as something you build into your life because the need is there and you have something to offer." "And me?" he said, still steady. "You've been doing it too. For 7 years. Raising Lily while running a business, doing it without a net, making it work without," she paused, "without asking anyone to applaud you for it. And the fact that you've done that you've come through it and built something real, that's the thing other people in the middle of it need to see. Not a pamphlet about resilience, an actual person." Elliot was quiet. "I'm not trying to make you into something symbolic," she said, because she'd thought about this and wanted to be clear about it. "I'm not asking you to be Nathaniel's legacy made flesh or any of that. I'm asking if you'd consider being involved in something real, as yourself. Because what you actually are is more useful than what I could invent." He looked at his coffee cup. "What would involved mean?" "Mentorship, for now. Working with parents in the program, the practical side of it. How you build a livable life when the structure you expected isn't there anymore. How you keep showing up for your kid when you're running empty." She paused. "And the skills piece, if you're willing. The restoration work. There are people who need work they can do, work that pays, that they can learn without a 4-year degree. You know how to teach that. Gerald Bauer taught you." Something shifted in Elliot's face at the mention of Gerald. Not sentiment exactly. More like recognition. "He taught me because someone taught him," Elliot said slowly. "Yes?" "You used to say that skills don't originate anywhere useful unless they travel." He paused. "I thought it was one of his 4 stories for a long time before I understood what he meant." "Do you understand now?" He looked at her. "Yeah." From the study, they heard Lily's footsteps and then her voice, not calling for either of them, just talking, in the quiet, patient tone she used when she was addressing something that couldn't respond. One of the photographs, probably. Vivian had seen her do it at the credenza on the first visit, standing in front of the photograph of Nathaniel mid-sentence, talking to him with the same earnest directness she'd used on the cat. They both listened for a moment without meaning to. "She talks to him," Elliot said, not surprised, just noting it. "She's been doing it since the first visit," Vivian said. A pause. "Is that—" He stopped. "Is that okay with you?" Vivian thought about it. Not the reflexive answer. The actual answer, the one that lived underneath the first one. Whether it was okay that a small child with no blood connection to Nathaniel had apparently decided, on her own private terms, to include him in her catalog of people worth talking to. "Yes," she said, "it's more than okay." Elliot nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank the last of it, which was cold by now, and set the cup down and looked at the table for a moment. I need to think about it, he said. The foundation. I don't make decisions like this fast. I'm not wired for it. I know. Take whatever time you need. She meant it. There's no urgency. There's always urgency with things that actually matter, he said. But I take your point. He paused. Can I ask you something honestly? Yes. Is this about Nathaniel? She held his gaze. Partly. The name will be for Nathaniel. The memorial garden gave me the model. Something living, something that grows. Not a plaque. Something that actually does something in the world. She paused. But it's not only about Nathaniel. It's about the specific problem I described, which exists whether or not I'd ever met you or found the compass or any of it. She stopped. The two things are connected. I'm not pretending they aren't, but one isn't just a vehicle for the other. He looked at her for a long moment with that quality of actual seeing. Then he nodded slowly, and she could see him accepting the answer. Not because he'd been convinced, but because it was honest, and he recognized honest. Okay, he said. Okay, you believe me? Or okay, you'll think about it? Both, he said, which was the most Elliot Mercer answer she could have gotten. Lily came back from the study. She climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table and looked at the remains of dinner with the assessing eye of someone determining whether there was anything worth returning to. The man in the photographs, she said without preamble. Both adults looked at her. The one in the garden picture, Lily said. She directed this at Vivian. He was your husband. Yes, Vivian said. Lily thought about this with visible seriousness. He looks like someone who would have a dog. A beat. He wanted one, Vivian said carefully. I was allergic. Lily looked at her with the mild reproach of a child who considers this a failure of prioritization. That's too bad for him. I felt terrible about it. You should get a dog now, Lily said. Since he can't. Elliot made a sound that he successfully converted into a cough. Vivian looked at Lily. The small face was entirely serious, the logic of the suggestion perfectly sound within its own framework. A man had wanted a dog. He'd been denied one on medical grounds. The person responsible for the denial now had an empty house and presumably functioning sinuses. The solution was self-evident. I'll consider it, Vivian said. Gerald is a cat, Lily said, as though clarifying that she understood the distinction. Gerald is fine, but dogs are better for big houses. You like dogs, Elliot said. Everyone likes dogs, Lily said, with the certainty of a statement she considered empirically settled. The evening moved on the way evenings do when they're going well, without fanfare, without the self-consciousness of trying to be a good evening. They washed dishes together, the three of them, which was a detail Vivian registered because it was the kind of ordinary thing that didn't happen in her house. Dana came by sometimes, but they didn't wash dishes together. The board members she occasionally had for dinners were not people who appeared in her kitchen. The intimacy of the ordinary, she thought. The specific warmth of someone just being in a house with you, doing the boring necessary things that houses require. Lily stood on the step stool Marcus kept in the kitchen for reaching the high shelves and dried dishes with the commitment of someone performing a serious function, occasionally asking Vivian where things went, occasionally asking Elliot if she was doing it right, occasionally simply commenting on the qualities of individual dishes with the frank critical attention of a professional assessor. This plate is my favorite, she said, holding up a blue and white one that Vivian had bought in a market in Portugal on the trip she'd taken the year after Nathaniel died. The trip where she'd cried in approximately 11 different locations across 2 weeks and come home feeling, not better, but more able to manage being herself. Why that one? Vivian asked. Lily examined it. The blue is a good blue. It is, Vivian agreed. I have a blue that's a good blue in my room, Lily said. A blanket. It was my mom's. She said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, without the careful protective wrapping that adults put around difficult subjects. It smells like her a little bit still. I don't wash it. Vivian was very careful with her voice. That sounds like the right call. Dad said maybe I should wash it because it was getting old. Lily looked at Elliot without accusation, just reporting. But he said I don't have to. I said you absolutely don't have to. Elliot said. He was looking at the dish he was washing with focused attention. I said I was wrong to suggest it. You apologized, Lily confirmed. Twice. Once would have been enough, Lily said generously, but the second one was nice. Vivian pressed her mouth together firmly. Later, with Lily asleep on the sofa under a blanket that Vivian had gotten from the hall cupboard, her breathing the even deep breathing of a child who crashes completely and without warning, Elliot and Vivian sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and the kind of quiet that has enough in it to not need filling. She's extraordinary, Vivian said. Not for the first time. She couldn't seem to stop saying it because it kept being true. She's not easy, Elliot said. She has opinions about everything. She pushes back on everything I say. She told me last week that I was wrong about the best way to make oatmeal and provided a 3-point argument. Was she right? He paused. Partly. The brown sugar amount was debatable. So she argued you to a draw. She argued me to a draw, he confirmed. He looked toward the living room where Lily's socked feet were visible over the arm of the sofa. She's been like that since she could talk. Sarah was the same way. He stopped, then continued more quietly. Lily doesn't know that. I haven't told her yet because she's 5 and I don't know how to explain it without it sounding like I'm saying she got it from someone she can't reach. But she'll know eventually. She's too much like Sarah for it not to come up. How will you tell her? He thought about it. I don't know exactly. I'll probably start by telling her about a conversation Sarah and I had once, an argument actually, about the right way to arrange a kitchen. He almost smiled. Sarah had very specific opinions about the relationship between the sink and the stove, and I thought she was wrong, and we went back and forth about it for 2 hours, and in the end she was right. A pause. I think I'll tell Lily that, and I'll say that's where she gets it from, the arguing until she's right. Vivian looked at him, at the way he'd worked that out just then, in real time. Not a rehearsed story, but a thought being built in the moment, the same way he worked on a piece of furniture. Carefully, with attention to what it actually was. You're a good father, she said. He didn't deflect it. He didn't perform humility. He just said, I'm trying to be, which was the truest thing a parent could say and the rarest thing to hear one say honestly. They sat for a moment. I've been thinking about what you said, he said. The foundation, the specific part about showing other parents what it actually looks like, the surviving of it. He turned his coffee cup. Not because you asked me to think about it faster. It didn't leave. Okay, she said. When I was in the worst of it, he said, after Sarah died, before Lily started being old enough to talk and joke and argue about oatmeal, I was alone in a way that I didn't have a language for. Not lonely, exactly. I had people around. My mother-in-law, friends, the crew I was working with. But none of them had done what I was doing. None of them had been widowed at 26 with a 1-year-old. He paused. I kept thinking there should be someone who could sit down and say, here's how I got through month 6. Here's what month 14 looked like. Not to fix it, just to make the territory visible. To tell me other people had been in this territory and come out the other side still functional. Was there anyone? Not really. There were groups, support groups, the grief kind. But they were all mixed. All different situations, and the specific weight of what I was dealing with wasn't something most people in the room had carried. He stopped. I figured it out on my own. I did okay, but I thought about it a lot. The people who were doing it alone and not okay because there was nobody to make the territory visible. Vivian was listening. That's what I can do, he said. If I'm involved, I can make the territory visible. He looked at her. Not as a success story, not as a, look how well it turned out, but as someone who was in it and knows what month 6 looks like and month 14 and month 37 and all the months in between. Yes, she said, that's exactly it. And the skills part. He paused. I want to think about that more carefully, not because I'm unwilling, because I want to do it right, and doing it right takes planning. What skills, for what people, with what resources, building toward what specific outcome? He looked at her. You have the same impulse, I think. You don't like doing things halfway. Doing things halfway is almost worse than not doing them, she said. You create the appearance of effort without the substance. Gerald again, he said. He used to say a half restoration was a lie about an object. You were claiming it was something it wasn't. Exactly. She paused. So, we'll plan it properly. Together? She looked at him. Yes. Together. He nodded, settled, like a piece of work that had found its right position. From the living room, Lily made a small sound in her sleep. A murmur, indeterminate, then silence. Both of them glanced toward the sound and back. A reflexive shared attention, the kind that happens between people who have, without making a formal decision about it, begun to be responsible to some common set of concerns. Vivian noticed it. She thought Elliot probably noticed it too, though he didn't comment. There's something else, she said. He waited. She got up and went to the study and came back with a box. A proper archival box, the acid-free kind, about the size of a shoebox but slightly deeper. She set it on the table. Elliot looked at it. Nathaniel kept records of his volunteer work, she said. Every rescue call, every training session, every piece of equipment he learned to use. He kept notebooks the same way Gerald Bauer kept notebooks. Full accounts, before and after, what was there and what was done about it. She opened the box. Inside were 8 composition notebooks, their covers worn, pages dense with his handwriting. I've had them in storage since he died. I've read them twice, once right after, once about 4 years ago. I keep thinking there's something I should do with them, and I never know what. Elliot looked at the notebooks. He didn't reach for them. What do you want to do with them? He asked. I want someone else to read them, she said. Someone who would understand what they are. A pause. You're asking me, he said. I'm asking you. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him understanding the weight of what was being offered, not just the notebooks, but the privacy of them, the internal account of a man she'd loved, the specific intimate record of years of someone's life. Are you sure? He said. I've been trying to figure out for 8 years what to do with these, she said. Giving them to an archive felt wrong. Too institutional, too far from what they actually were. Keeping them in storage felt like putting them in a room with no windows. She looked at the box. You knew him for one night, but the night you knew him was the same as every other night of his life. You'd understand what you were reading. Elliot reached out slowly and touched the cover of the top notebook. Lightly, the way he probably touched pieces he was assessing. The careful initial contact of someone who understood that objects held information you could only receive by paying attention. I'll take care of them, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm giving them to you. He left just after 9:30, carrying a sleeping Lily against his shoulder, with the practiced ease of 10,000 previous carries, her orange coat bundled under his arm, the archival box of notebooks set carefully on the back seat of the truck, secured so it wouldn't slide. Vivian stood in the doorway in the cold and watched the truck back out of the drive. Lily's face was pressed into Elliot's neck, entirely slack with sleep, her mouth slightly open. Before he got in, Elliot turned once. Thank you for dinner, he said. Thank you for coming. A pause, the sleet having thinned to nothing, the night cold and clear now around them. The foundation, he said. I'm in. I wanted you to know before I left. Vivian looked at him. You said you needed time. I said I needed to think about it. I thought about it. He opened the truck door. Some things you think about until they're clear, and then you stop thinking and decide. This one's clear. She watched the truck go. She stood in the doorway until the taillights were gone, and then she stayed there another minute anyway, looking at the empty drive, the cold air on her face, the night quiet around the house. Something was building. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing. Not the event itself yet, but the pressure that precedes it, the quality of air that tells you something is coming and that it will be real and that it will require you to meet it. She went inside. In the study, the credenza held its record of Nathaniel's life. The photographs, the letters, the books with his handwriting in the margins, the small wooden tray at the center, which had held the compass briefly and then been empty for weeks, still empty, still waiting for her to decide what it was for. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and washed the last of the cups and turned off the lights and walked through the quiet house to bed. And for the first time in as long as she could properly remember, She fell asleep before she'd finished thinking. The Compass Hope Foundation opened its doors on a Thursday in March, which was not a glamorous month for openings, but which Vivian had chosen deliberately because March was when things actually started. Not the announcement of beginning, but the beginning itself, the ground softening, the light returning by increments, the world doing the unglamorous work of coming back. The space was a converted warehouse in the Delmore district, 3 miles from the center of the city, chosen because the rent was honest, and the neighborhood was the one where most of the people they intended to serve actually lived. Vivian had looked at 7 locations before settling on this one. Dana had the spreadsheet. Elliot had come to look at 4 of them and said what he thought without softening it, which was the quality she'd come to rely on most in the 5 months between the Wednesday dinner and the Thursday opening. The building had good bones, his phrase, which she'd absorbed without noticing, and bad everything else. The heating system was original to 1962. 2 of the skylights leaked. The floor was concrete painted in a shade of institutional green that appeared to have been chosen by someone who had never experienced joy. They'd fixed the heating and the skylights and put money into the things that mattered: the workshop space, the classroom, the small private rooms for one-on-one sessions. And Vivian had repainted the floor herself on a Saturday in January, on her hands and knees with a roller brush, because she'd wanted to understand the space physically before she put her name on it. Dana had not commented on this decision. Dana had shown up with better knee pads and a second roller brush. Elliot had shown up an hour later with Lily, who had strong opinions about the color choice and whose opinions turned out to be correct. The floor was now a warm, particular shade of ochre that Lily had identified in a hardware store swatch and that Vivian had looked at for 30 seconds and understood immediately was right. It made the light from the skylights do something unexpected and good. Every person who walked in commented on it. No one could exactly say why it worked. Lily, when told this, had nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose professional assessment had been validated by the market. The opening was not a gala. That had been a conscious, non-negotiable decision from the beginning. No chandeliers, no marble, no $500 plates. There was food from a Vietnamese place 4 blocks over that did the best catering in the neighborhood for a quarter of what the hotel caterers charged. And there were folding tables and mismatched chairs and the kind of noise that comes from people who are actually talking to each other rather than performing at each other. Vivian had invited 60 people. 30 of them were the professional category: board members, a few people from the city's social services infrastructure, 2 journalists from outlets that covered community development rather than society pages. The other 30 were the category that actually mattered: parents currently enrolled in the foundation's first cohort, along with the mentors who'd signed on to work with them. Single mothers mostly, with a handful of single fathers. People in the specific hard middle of what Elliot had described, past the initial shock of loss or abandonment or collapse, not yet at the other side of it, in the territory that needed to be made visible. Elliot stood near the workshop entrance with a coffee in his hand and the compass against his chest, talking to a man named Derek, who had 2 sons under 8 and was 6 months out of a marriage that had ended badly and who had been in the foundation's skills program for 3 weeks, learning basic furniture restoration. Derek was talking about a chair he was working on, a Victorian balloon back that had come in with a cracked rear leg, and Elliot was listening with the focused attention he brought to problems that interested him, which was most problems. Vivian watched them from across the room and thought about Gerald Bauer and his converted dairy barn, patient on a geological timescale, and about the way skills traveled. She hadn't told Elliot she was watching. He wouldn't have behaved differently if she had. That was one of the things she'd learned about him in 5 months. He was the same in every room, talking to her, or talking to Derek, or talking to Lily about the correct amount of brown sugar in oatmeal. There was no performance version. It was either a quality of character or a quality of exhaustion so complete that the performance had simply worn away, and she suspected it was the former. Dana appeared at her elbow. The journalist from the Delmore Courier wants 5 minutes. 10 minutes, Vivian said. She'll take it. Dana looked at Elliot and Derek across the room. He's good at this. He's good at most things, Vivian said. He just doesn't announce it. Unlike most people in your professional circle. Unlike most people in my professional circle, she agreed. The journalist was a woman named Patricia Holt, who wrote about neighborhood economics and community infrastructure, and who had the quality Vivian most respected in journalists. She was interested in the actual story rather than the story she'd already written in her head before arriving. They talked for 20 minutes instead of 10, and Patricia asked good questions and wrote things down and looked at the workshop and the classroom and asked about the specific population the foundation was designed to serve and why the skills component existed alongside the mentorship component and what the theory of change actually was. Vivian told her. Not the polished version, not the version she'd refined for the board presentations, the real one, the one that started with a man who showed up on a mountain road in a storm and never left his name, and a compass that traveled 7 years to find its way back, and two people who'd found each other in a hotel ballroom and recognized, between them, something that needed building. Patricia was quiet for a moment after that. "Is that in your official materials?" she asked. "Not yet," Vivian said. "It should be." Vivian thought about that for the rest of the opening, about what it meant to put the real story into the official materials, to let the origin of the thing be visible, not as marketing, not as a feel-good narrative to soften the corporate edges of a foundation, but as the actual true account of how one thing led to another. Nathaniel's notebooks were in Elliot's workshop on the shelf above the tool rack, read twice and handled carefully, and returned in the same condition he'd received them. Elliot had told her what he'd found in them. Not a summary, a real account, sitting across from her in her kitchen with the notebook open and his voice steady, reading her the parts she hadn't known. The calls in bad weather, the training notes, technical and precise. The personal observations, brief and infrequent but vivid when they appeared. A line about a family he'd helped evacuate in a flood, another about a hiker who'd been 3 hours from dying of exposure and who had, upon being found, immediately worried about whether his dog was okay. His dog was okay. Nathaniel had noted that specifically. Told him the dog was fine, didn't know for certain, told him anyway because he needed to hear it, and then we'd make it true. She'd cried when Elliot read that. Not collapsed, just the clean, specific kind of crying that comes from recognition, from hearing something that confirms what you knew but had never seen written down. Elliot had kept reading until she indicated he should stop, and then he'd stopped, and they'd sat quietly for a while, and it had been the right thing to do. She thought about all of that standing in the converted warehouse on a Thursday in March, watching the people in her first cohort move through the space with the cautious energy of people who aren't yet sure this is a place they belong, but who are willing to find out. That caution was the thing she'd been most worried about. Not the logistics, not the funding, not the infrastructure. Whether the people who needed this most would believe it was actually for them, or whether they'd walk in and feel the usual thing. The thing philanthropic spaces so often communicated without meaning to, that they were the recipients of someone else's generosity, the objects of pity dressed up as programs. She'd talked to Elliot about this extensively. He'd talked to the first cohort about it himself, in the intake sessions, before she'd been in the room, talking to them the way he'd talked to her that first night, with the particular directness of someone who had no use for the careful packaging of uncomfortable truths. "I'm not here because I figured it out," she'd heard him tell a woman named Miriam, 41, 3 kids, whose husband had left 8 months earlier. "I'm here because someone showed me it was possible to keep going, and I haven't stopped thinking about what I owe that forward. That's the whole story. You're not a charity case. You're the reason the thing exists." Miriam had looked at him with the specific expression of someone who was checking for sincerity and finding it. Then she'd nodded and said, "Okay." And that was the beginning of her enrollment. The opening wound down by 8. The last guests were the ones who always stayed longest at these things. The people who'd found a conversation they didn't want to leave, or who were lingering because leaving meant going back to the empty, specific weight of their particular lives. Vivian moved through them without rushing anyone, topping up drinks, listening to what needed listening to. Derek showed her a photograph on his phone of the Victorian balloon-backed chair he was working on, still in pieces, the cracked leg clamped and drying, and talked about what he thought it was going to look like when it was done. And the talking about it had the quality of someone who had started to believe again in the category of things getting done. Lily had fallen asleep on Elliot's jacket in the corner of the classroom, which nobody had planned but which also nobody had the heart to disturb. She lay with her cheek against the collar and her knees drawn up, breathing with the total commitment of a child who is completely out, oblivious to the remaining conversations and the sound of chairs being stacked. Vivian sat down on the floor next to her. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't a graceful thing to do in the clothes she was wearing, but it felt right, and she'd been doing more things that felt right without needing to justify them, which was a change she'd noticed in herself over the past months and hadn't fully named yet. Lily's face in sleep looked very young. It always did. The daytime expression, animated and evaluative and frequently incredulous, gave way to something simple and unguarded. She had Sarah's nose, Elliot had told her once, looking at a photograph, and his patience when she was sleeping. Vivian looked at her and thought about what this child had and what she'd lost, and what had been built around both things to make the loss navigable. The box with the pretty rock and the letters and the tooth and the photograph of Sarah. The unwashed blue blanket. The stories told and retold about a woman she'd never remember meeting. The father who showed up, kept showing up, made the territory visible just by remaining in it and not falling apart, or by falling apart in private and then pulling himself back together and returning to the kitchen to make oatmeal with the correct amount of brown sugar. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. Lily was going to have bad years and hard questions and grief that arrived late, the way grief sometimes does when you're old enough to understand what you actually lost. Elliot knew that. He'd said it once, sitting at her kitchen table at 11 at night after Lily was asleep, saying it the way he said things that cost him something. Simply, without elaboration, just putting the fact on the table. She's going to have to reckon with it eventually, he'd said. The real weight of it. When she's old enough to understand that her mother should be here and isn't. A pause. I can't protect her from that. I can just make sure she doesn't do it alone. That's all anyone can do, Vivian had said. I know. He'd looked at his hands. Doesn't make it easier to know. No, she'd agreed. It doesn't. They'd sat with that for a while, the way they sat with difficult things, not trying to resolve them, just keeping company with them. She'd learned that from him, or relearned it, the way you sometimes relearn things you knew once and forgot. That some things didn't need fixing, that the appropriate response to certain facts was not a solution but a witness. Elliot appeared in the doorway of the classroom. He looked at Lily, then at Vivian on the floor beside her, and something in his expression did the thing she'd become familiar with over months. The slight softening, the look of a man who has been surprised by something and is in the process of deciding how to feel about being surprised. He sat down on the floor on the other side of Lily. The three of them in the classroom, 2 adults and a sleeping child. The chairs stacked along the walls, the ochre floor catching the overhead light. Good opening, he said quietly so as not to wake her. It was, Vivian said. She meant it without reservation, which was unusual for her. She was constitutionally inclined to find the thing that could have gone better, to carry the marginal failure alongside the success. Tonight she didn't feel that. Tonight it had been enough. Derek is going to be all right, she said. Yeah, he's got good hands, better than he knows yet. You'll tell him. When the time is right, not yet. Too soon, and he won't believe it. He looked at the floor. He needs to feel it in the work first. Then you can put a word to it. She thought about that, about the sequence of things, first the experience, then the language for it, the way you couldn't give someone the name for something they hadn't yet felt in their hands. The journalist, she said, Patricia Holt. She wants to write about the origin story. Elliot glanced at her. The gala. All of it. The compass, the mountain, how we found each other, how the foundation came from that. She paused. I told her it should be in the official materials. She said the same thing independently. What do you think? She looked at Lily's sleeping face. I think Nathaniel would have hated it, she said. He'd have said the story wasn't the point, the work was the point. And putting the story front and center was a way of making it about the people telling it instead of the people it was for. He'd be right. He would. She paused. And I also think there are people who are going to walk through that door out there and feel like this isn't for them. Like it's some institution that looks good from the outside and doesn't have anything real inside it. And the story, the real story, not the cleaned up version, is the thing that might tell them the truth. That this came from actual loss, actual hard years, not from wealth wanting to perform generosity. Elliot was quiet. So I think both things are true, she said, and I think I need to find a way to tell the story that doesn't make it about us. That keeps Nathaniel in the right position, which is not the symbol, the person. An actual person who drove too fast on mountain roads and wanted a dog, and had a compass he bought for $40 and wore every day for 15 years. She stopped. Does that make sense? Yeah, Elliot said. It does. A pause. The wooden compasses, she said. For the skills program's graduates, they'd decided early on that there would be something made, something physical, something that marked the completion of the thing. Elliot had suggested it, and she'd understood immediately why it was right. Not a certificate, not a plaque. Something made by hand, made of wood, each one slightly different because the hand that made it was always slightly different. A small compass, the same octagonal shape as Nathaniel's silver one, the rose detail on the back. Elliot had spent 2 months refining the design and the making process until he could produce one that looked like it had been made deliberately rather than industrially, and that could be replicated by the people in the program once they'd learned enough. The first one he'd made for himself. He kept it on the workbench in his shop, next to the tools. The second one he'd given to Vivian. She kept it in the small wooden tray on the credenza, in the space where Nathaniel's silver compass had rested briefly before she'd known better. It wasn't a substitute. It was something different, an object that had been made in full knowledge of the story by a person who understood it, for a person who needed something in that space that was alive and present rather than preserved in past. She'd told him that when he gave it to her. He'd looked at her for a moment and then said simply, "Good." Outside the classroom window, the March night had gone clear. Vivian could see a section of sky between the buildings, the particular dark of the city at night. Not black, never fully black, but the deep orange-tinged almost dark of a sky that carries the light from 1,000,000 inhabited windows. Lily stirred. She turned over, found the jacket, resettled. Didn't wake. "She's going to ask you about Sarah more as she gets older," Vivian said. Not a warning, just a fact she'd been thinking about. "I know. She's going to ask questions you won't have answers to." "I know that too." He looked at his daughter. Sarah liked the mountains. She wasn't outdoorsy. She'd have been honest about that, but she liked driving through them. We took one trip, before Lily was born, through the Cascades, and she spent most of it just looking out the window. He paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to take Lily there. Not a pilgrimage, just a trip. So she knows the thing her mother loved." Vivian looked at him. "Take her. It's a long drive. She likes the truck. She argues with the truck when it doesn't start," he said. "She argues with everything. She'll be fine." A pause. "I'll come if you want company. Not if you'd rather it be just the two of you, but if you want company." He looked at her. There it was, the thing that had been building between them for 5 months, handled with the careful mutual attention of two people who had both been broken in the specific way that loss breaks you, and who were both, without discussing it explicitly, aware that they were moving toward something and that neither of them wanted to move faster than the thing could honestly bear. It was not romantic in the performative sense. There were no declared feelings, no pivotal moments with cinematic lighting. It was something more like the slow recognition of two people who had started to need each other's company in a way that went past usefulness, who had started to arrange their weeks around the presence of the other without quite admitting that's what they were doing. Vivian had noticed it first, she thought. Had noticed it and not said anything because she wasn't sure what to say, because the vocabulary for this particular situation, widowed woman, widowed man, a dead husband's compass between them, a foundation, a child, 5 months of dinners and floor painting and reading notebooks aloud and building something real, didn't exist in the standard categories. She'd spent time trying to classify it and had finally stopped trying because classification was not the same as understanding, and she'd learned, in this of all years, the difference. Elliot looked at her for a long moment, long enough to be unmistakable. "I'd want company," he said. She nodded. "Not more than that. Not yet. But enough." Lily woke up 20 minutes later with the abrupt total alertness she always deployed, sat up, looked around the classroom, assessed the situation with the comprehensive efficiency of a small person who has learned to orient quickly in new environments. "Did I miss it?" she asked. "Most of it," Elliot said. "Not all." She looked at Vivian. "Did people like it?" "They did." Lily thought about this. "Did they like the floor?" "Several people mentioned the floor specifically," Vivian said. Lily nodded with deep satisfaction. She picked up Elliot's jacket from the floor and handed it to him, stood up, smoothed her clothes with the automatic efficiency of a child who has been told enough times to straighten up before going somewhere. Then she looked at the doorway to the main space. "Can I see the compasses?" she said. The compasses were in the workshop, the 12 wooden ones that had been made over the previous 6 weeks, one for each person in the first cohort, lined up on the work table. Elliot had brought them from his shop that morning, each one wrapped in cloth, and Vivian had arranged them on the table without quite being able to look at them all at once, without feeling something too large to easily name. They went into the workshop together, the 3 of them. The main space was mostly cleared now, the last of the guests gone or going, Dana doing final logistics near the entrance. The workshop had been left lit, the overhead fluorescents and the lower work lights both on, the kind of combined light that made the wood glow. Lily went directly to the table. She stood before the row of compasses and looked at them with the seriousness she brought to things she considered worth examining. She didn't touch. She just looked. "They're all different," she said. "Yes," Elliot said, "but they're all compasses." "Yes." She looked at the one at the center of the row, slightly larger than the others, the rose detail on the back carved more deeply, the wood darker. That was the prototype, the first one Elliot had made to get the design right, and Vivian had asked him to include it in the row because she wanted it there, among the others, not set apart. Lily pointed at it. "That one is older." "It's the first one," Elliot said. Lily looked at it for another moment. Then she looked at the silver compass against Elliot's chest. Nathaniel's compass, worn and real, 15 years of being carried, and 2 years of being passed between people who needed to understand what they were holding. Then back at the wooden one on the table. "They match," she said. "Almost," Vivian said. "Not exactly." "Almost is close enough," Lily said, with the certainty of a 5-year-old who has decided the philosophical question is settled. Vivian looked at the row of compasses on the table. 12 people who had come through the door of a converted warehouse and learned something real, about wood, about repair, about the specific difficult practice of staying present in a life that had required more than they'd signed up for. 12 people who would leave with something made by hand, something that would sit on a shelf or a desk or get carried in a pocket, something that said, not in words, because objects don't use words, but in the way that objects speak, that they had done a hard thing and were still here and were pointed somewhere. It was not the end of anything. The first cohort was finishing and the second cohort was already enrolled, and there were more people in the Delmore district and the surrounding neighborhoods who needed what this place offered than she could serve in a decade. And she knew that, and she was not frightened by it the way she might have been 8 years ago when her operating mode was control through preparation, and the idea of a problem that couldn't be fully solved was a category she didn't have resources for. She had different resources now. She thought about Nathaniel, the way she thought about him every day, which had never stopped, and which she no longer expected to stop, and which she had finally, in this particular year, stopped categorizing as a problem to solve. He was in the room, in the way that the people who shaped you are always in the room, not as presence, but as the particular shape they carved in you by being there, the outline they left, the direction they pointed you. He was in the compasses on the table, and the ochre floor that Lily chose, and the notebooks on Elliot's shelf, and the story she was going to tell Patricia Holt about a man who stopped on a mountain road in a storm because he was physically incapable of not stopping, and who never waited around to see what the stopping cost him, and who was gone before anyone could tell him what it meant. You can't tell the dead what they meant. That's the specific cruelty of losing someone. The accounting always happens after, when the person who needs to know is already elsewhere. Vivian had spent 8 years angry about that, at various levels of conscious intensity, and she was no longer angry about it. She was just also something else alongside the anger, something that had room in it, something that had learned to carry both. She had the notebook she'd written at the kitchen table, Elliot's words in her hand. She had the photograph from the mountain road, Nathaniel mid-departure at the edge of the frame. She had the 12 wooden compasses on the table and the 60 people who had been in this room tonight and the cohort starting next month, and Derek's Victorian balloon-back chair drying in the workshop with its cracked leg clamped and setting, becoming what it was supposed to be. She had Elliot, who read Nathaniel's notebooks on his workshop shelf and took care of things and told hard truths simply and showed up to fix gate hinges without being asked and was going to take his daughter through the Cascades because Sarah had loved looking at mountains from a moving car. She had Lily, who renamed cats and argued about oatmeal and talked to photographs of people she'd never met and chose the right shade of ochre from a hardware store swatch with the confidence of someone who trusted her own perception and hadn't yet been taught not to. Lily picked up one of the wooden compasses from the table, not the prototype, one from the middle of the row, made by someone in the first cohort during their 4th week of learning, still slightly rough at one edge, where the hand had gotten impatient. She turned it over, the way Vivian had turned Nathaniel's silver one on the night of the gala, looking at the rose detail on the back. "It shows you which way to go," she asked. She'd asked this before, the night of the gala, about the silver compass, and Vivian had given an answer she'd meant at the time, and that had since become more specific. "It shows you which way you're pointed," Vivian said. "Not where to go, just which direction you're already facing." Lily considered this. "And then you decide?" "And then you decide." Lily looked at the compass in her hand for a long moment. Small face, serious, the workshop light making the wood warm in her palm. Then she set it back in its place on the table, gently, exactly as she'd found it. "Okay," she said, "that was all. Just okay, with the simplicity of a child who has understood something and filed it and is ready to move on, because the evening was late and she was 5 and there were other things in the world." Elliot put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it. He looked at Vivian over the top of her head, and in that look was everything they hadn't said yet and didn't need to say tonight. The understanding that they had arrived somewhere, the 3 of them, that wasn't yet finished and wasn't supposed to be. That was the beginning of something that didn't have a clean name and didn't need one. Outside, the March night was cold and clear. The city ran its usual indifferent operations, traffic, light, the sound of people moving between their lives. Inside the warehouse on Delmore Street, 12 wooden compasses sat on a work table in a room that smelled like sawdust and new paint, each one slightly different from the others, each one bearing the same rose on its back, each one waiting for the hands that would carry it into whatever came next. A man had stopped on a mountain road in a storm. He'd done what he could. He'd walked away without waiting to be thanked, which was who he was, which was the thing she'd loved most and grieved hardest and finally made peace with. Not because she'd stopped wanting him back, but because she'd understood that the walking away without waiting for thanks was not a withdrawal. It was a kind of faith. Faith that what you put into the world goes somewhere real, that it lands in people and travels forward through them, that a compass can change hands 2 or 3 times and still point true. She believed that now. Not as comfort, as fact. She turned off the work table lights and followed Elliot and Lily out into the night, pulling the door closed behind her, the lock catching solid, the building holding everything inside it steady until morning.